Welcome to Harry's Cosmos. Today's adventure, what if Regulus Black survived the cave and raised Harry and Hermione as his own? If you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1, The First Winter. The sea did not stop for grief. It came in gray and went out gray, and it took the light with it both ways, so that the cottage at Kittiwake spent the short December days in a kind of underwater dusk. Regulus Black had chosen the place for exactly that reason. No one looked twice at a house that could barely be seen. He stood at the low window with a child on his hip and watched the tide argue with the rocks. The child was called Harry. Regulus had known this for 9 days and still had to remind himself of it. The way you remind yourself of a foreign word you have only just learned, turning it in the mouth to see if it belongs there. Harry, 16 months old, give or take, with a scar on his forehead like a badly healed lightning strike, and a habit of grabbing whatever hair was nearest and pulling it like a bell rope for service. At present, the nearest hair was Regulus's own. He unhooked the small fist without any particular ceremony and set it back on Harry's knee. "We don't," he said, "do that." Harry considered this. Then he reached up and did it again. Outside, the light failed a little more. Somewhere behind Regulus, in the belly of the house, a kettle began to complain, and the complaint was answered by the soft slap of an elf's feet on cold flags. He had not planned any of it. That was the thing he kept circling back to, in the long gray hours when the child slept and the sea talked to itself. He had planned only to die. He had planned it carefully, the way he planned everything, with a false name and a stolen boat and a locket that weighed on his chest like a swallowed stone. He had gone into the cave meaning not to come out. The dead in the black water had reached for him with their soft ruined hands, and he had welcomed it, or told himself he did, right up until the moment creature's magic tore him loose and flung them both back into the world with the taste of the potion still burning behind his eyes. He had spent a year afterward believing it a mistake. A whole year in this cold house, sick and hidden and useless, while a war he had helped make went on burning without him. He had learned to hate the sound of his own breathing, the plain fact of it continuing. And then the war had ended in a single night, in a cottage in the west that was not so different from this one. And a woman he had never met had died standing in front of her son, and the man who had killed her had come apart against a child too young to remember it. Regulus had read it in the newspaper Creature brought, 3 days late and salt-stained. He had read it 4 times. Then he had gone very quietly to a chair and sat in it for the better part of an hour, and Creature had not disturbed him. Harry in the paper was his brother's godson. That detail the paper did not print, but Regulus knew it. The way he knew a great many things nobody had thought to tell him. Sirius was godfather to James Potter's son. And Sirius was in Azkaban now, taken up on the same night screaming in the street about a rat, and the ministry had not troubled to hear him out, so his son would go to his mother's sister. That was the plan the good and careful people had made. A muggle house in a muggle town. A family who had loathed the very word magic. And a child with the Dark Lord's mark burned into his skin left on their doorstep with a note, like a bottle of milk. Regulus had gone and looked at the house. He was not proud of the ease with which he did it. Old habits of concealment. The training of a boy raised to move through the world unseen. He had stood across the road under a disillusionment charm and watched a heavy man mow a small square of grass in a temper, and a thin woman watch the neighbors through a gap in the curtains. And he had thought, no. Not a considered no. Not a no he could have defended to the mother who had raised him, who would have said the lad was a half-blood and none of his concern, and that a black did not stoop. Just a flat animal refusal of a thing that has spent a year deciding it deserves nothing and finds, to its own surprise, that it still wants one thing after all. He had taken Harry at night. It had been almost too easy, which frightened him more than difficulty would have. A word key to blood, and Harry was the last of that blood. It had opened for Regulus the way a door opens for a man who owns the house, because in the crooked logic of old magic he was near enough kin. He had lifted the sleeping child out of a cupboard under the stairs. They had already put him in the cupboard on the first night, and that too had helped make up whatever passed for Regulus's mind, and carried him out into the dark, and no alarm had sounded, and no one had come. "He is heavier than he looks," Regulus told the window now. Harry had gone slack against his shoulder, thumb in his mouth, done with the day. "You are heavier than you look. I want that noted." The kettle had stopped. Creature appeared in the doorway with a chipped cup on a chipped saucer, both held with the reverence of a man carrying the crown jewels. "Master should sit," Creature said. "Master is gray. Master is always gray. It's the light. It is not the light. It is not the light." The elf's enormous eyes went from Regulus to the sleeping child and softened by a degree Regulus was not meant to see. "Creature will take the young." He stopped. He had not settled on a word for Harry either. The young master stuck in his throat. The child was a Potter, a half-blood, and Creature's whole self had been built around the horror of such things, and was now quietly disassembling itself in the presence of one small warm body that grabbed his ears and laughed. "Creature will take him," the elf finished, and did, gathering the child against his own thin chest with a competence that shamed Regulus, who at 20 had held perhaps 3 children in his life and dropped none of them only through luck. Regulus drank his tea. It was too hot and he drank it anyway, because the burn was something to feel that wasn't the other thing. He had a locket in a box in a room with no door, sealed behind stone he had grown himself out of the cottage wall. Some nights he could hear it, not with his ears. He would wake with the certainty that someone in the house was awake and hating him, and he would lie still in the dark and count until the certainty passed. He had not found a way to destroy it. He had tried, in that first sick year, everything a clever and desperate young man could think of. And the thing had only laughed at him in the private language it used, and once had shown him his brother's face, and once his own, dead in the water where he had meant to leave it. He did not think about the locket while he held his son. That was Rule 1, though he had not written it anywhere. Rule 1 was that the two did not touch. The dead thing in the wall and the living thing in his arms occupied different countries, and Regulus stood the border between them and would go on standing it. He finished the tea. Outside, the last of the light went, all at once, the way it did here in December. Like someone remembering a door left open and shutting it. Hermione came to them in the deepest part of that winter, when the snow had reached the windowsills and the sea had gone the color of a knife. Regulus had not gone looking for her. He wanted that clear, at least to himself, because the alternative was a picture of a man who collected orphans the way another man might collect stamps, and he could not stand that picture. He had gone to Cornwall on the locket's account, chasing a rumor of an old cursebreaker who might know what he did not, and the rumor had come to nothing. And on the way back to the coast, he had passed through a village with its church bell tolling and its street too quiet, and he had done the thing he always did, which was to find out why. Death Eaters, not the great names. Those were mostly in Azkaban with his brother, or dead or busy convincing the world they had been under a spell. These were the smaller ones, the ones the fall had left with nothing to hunt and a great deal of unspent cruelty, and they had come to this village on the flimsiest of grudges, some slight from before the war, and they had burned a house at the end of a lane, a dentist and his wife. Muggles. The village did not have the word for what had happened. It was already deciding to remember a gas leak. Regulus stood at the black edge of the ruined house in the falling dark and understood in one glance the entire shape of it. The way a man raised in that world could read a scene the way others read a page, and then a piece of the shape moved. A shed at the bottom of the garden, half its roof gone, and inside it, a small sound that was not the wind. She was not quite 2.5, and she had been in the shed for a day and a night. She had a blanket that had been blue, and a rabbit that had been white, and a fury in her that Regulus recognized before he understood it, because it was the fury of someone who has decided, at an age too young to have any business deciding anything, that she will simply not be beaten. She had not cried herself out. She was still crying, hoarse and steady, a child's protest lodged so deep it had become a kind of engine. When the shed door opened, she stopped and looked at the stranger and did not reach for him. She held her rabbit tighter and stared, weighing him with a solemn ferocity that a lesser man might have laughed at. Regulus did not laugh. He crouched in the ruined doorway so that he was no longer looming, which he had learned in 9 weeks was the whole art of it, and he said in the flat, undramatic voice he used for the lad, "Your name is Hermione." He had read it off a scorched envelope in the garden, half of a letter to a Miss Hermione J. Granger, age 2, from an aunt in Australia. It was the only true thing he had to offer her, her own name, and he offered it plainly, and something in the child's terrible little face came loose. "That's not much," he admitted. "I know it isn't. But it's yours, and no one can take it, and I'm going to keep it safe for you until you're big enough to keep it yourself. Do you understand?" She did not, of course. She was 2. But she heard the shape of a promise the way children hear it, in the tone under the words, and when he held out his hand, she looked at it for a long moment, and then, with the air of a general accepting difficult terms, put her rabbit into it, not her own hand, the rabbit. As if to say, this first, and we'll see about the rest. Regulus took the rabbit with total gravity, tucked it into the crook of his arm as he had learned to tuck Harry, and only then did she consent to be lifted. He did not think of himself as a kind man. He thought of himself as a man who had done a great deal of harm and was trying, in a small and hidden way, to do slightly less of it. But walking out of that dead garden with a stranger's daughter asleep at last against his shoulder and her rabbit crushed between them, he understood that he had crossed a line he would not be able to walk back across, and that he did not want to. "Two," Creature said, when Regulus came in out of the snow. The elf looked at the sleeping girl. He looked at Regulus. Some very old part of him, the part that had served a mother who would have burned this muggle-born child's name out of any tapestry it touched, made one last stand behind his eyes. "2 of them, master." "2, Regulus agreed. He was too tired to make it a fight, warm the small room, and find where the other one has hidden my wand, because he's been at it again, and I'm not searching the flower bin twice in 1 week." Creature looked at the girl a moment longer. Then he did a thing Regulus had never seen him do, in all the years the elf had haunted the edges of his childhood. He reached up, very carefully, and tucked the fallen corner of the blue blanket back over the child's bare foot. And having done it, he turned and stumped off to warm the small room, muttering so that no one could accuse him of softness about the disgrace of the modern world. There is no dignity in the early raising of small children, and Regulus, who had been raised to prize dignity above nearly everything, lost his that winter in 100 undignified ways and was better for the losing. He learned that Harry would eat anything that was orange and refuse anything that was green, and that this could not be reasoned with, and that pretending a spoon was a broomstick worked exactly twice before the child caught on and began demanding an actual broomstick. He learned that Hermione did not cry when she was hurt so much as go silent and rigid and furious, and that the trick was not to fuss, but to sit near her and wait, and that if he read aloud to no one in particular, she would drift over and install herself against his side to correct his pronunciation, which she did at 2.5 by pointing and scowling until he got it right. He learned that they fought. Of course they fought. They were small animals in a small house in a long winter. Harry took things and Hermione organized things, and these were incompatible philosophies. But he learned too that if either of them woke in the night frightened, the other woke a moment later, some string strung between them plucking taut, and that they would end the night in the same cot no matter which one he had put them into, curled like a pair of parentheses around the same emptiness. He learned that he could not do it alone, and that he did not have to, because Creature, who had loved exactly one person in the last 50 years, and that person Regulus himself, had found in these two the thing that had been missing since the old house went quiet, which was someone small to protect. The elf who had once wept at the thought of mudbloods now sat on the floor for hours building towers of driftwood for a muggle-born girl to knock down, and caught them when they fell, and built them again, and did not seem to notice the contradiction, or had decided the contradiction was none of the world's business. Regulus watched all this from the border he stood, the one between the dead thing and the living, and found the border harder to hold than he had expected, because the living side kept flooding over it. He would mean to spend an evening on the locket, on the problem of it, and instead spend it with a feverish boy asleep on his chest, afraid to move for fear of waking him, running through black family curse lore in his head, not to break anything but simply to stay awake, to keep watch, to be the thing standing between this small hot weight and whatever came in the dark. He did not tell them he loved him. He would not have known how. The word had not been used in the house he grew up in except as a weapon or a lever, but he told them a great many other things. He told Harry, wrestling him into a jumper, that a black did not surrender to a garment, and Harry, who could not yet say black, said whack and surrendered to nothing thereafter, least of all jumpers. He told Hermione, who had begun to ask why about roughly everything in the visible universe, that a question was the bravest thing a person could carry and that she must never set hers down for anyone, and she took him at his word so completely that he spent the rest of the winter answering why until his own throat gave out. Once, in February, the locket got loose. It was nothing dramatic, as these things went. He had gone into the sealed room to check the wards, as he did once a month, bracing for nothing, simply doing the joyless work, and the thing had reached for him the way it always did, whispering in the language it used, showing him the water and the dead and his own drowned face. He had endured it, as he always did, but this time it found something new to use. It showed him the two children asleep in the small room, and it showed them older, and it showed them dead, one after the other, in 100 small domestic ways, and it did this with the patience of a thing that has all the time in the world and only one pleasure left in it. Regulus came out of the room gray to the lips and shut the stone behind him and stood in the cold passage with his hand flat against the wall, and he did not go to the children, because rule 1 was that the dead thing and the living things did not touch, and he would not carry it to their door even in his own head. He stood there a long time. Then he went out into the snow, coatless, and stood in the sea wind until the cold had scoured him clean, and only then did he go inside and look in on them. Two dark heads on one pillow. Harry had a fist wound in Hermione's sleeve. Hermione had, in sleep, arranged herself between his son and the door. No, Regulus told the thing in the wall, quietly, so that only it could hear. You don't get them. That's the one thing. Take the rest. You don't get them. The house made no answer, but he thought the whispering, for that night at least, grew quieter, the way a bully quiets when it learns which threat lands and which does not. Spring was a long way off. This far north it came grudging and late, and the winter had teeth in it still when the first real crisis of Regulus's fatherhood arrived, and it arrived, as such things do, disguised as a small thing. Harry got sick, not the ordinary sick of a running nose and a foul temper, which they had both had a dozen times and which Regulus had learned to nurse with the grim patience of a soldier. This was other. It came on in a night, the lad hot as a coal, breathing quick and shallow, his eyes gone glassy and far away, and a bloom of something spreading under the skin of his chest that was not a rash any muggle doctor would have named, because it was not a muggle thing. It moved. In the low lamplight, Regulus watched it move under the skin like ink dropped in water, and he knew it, and the knowing turned his blood to river water. The scar. It was coming off the scar. He had known, in the abstract, that the mark on Harry's forehead was not an ordinary scar. He had felt it the first night, holding the sleeping child, a wrongness at the edge of his own dark-trained senses, a cold hollow in an otherwise warm little body. He had told himself it was healing. He had told himself a great many things. Now the wrongness had woken and put out roots, and his son, he used the word to himself for the first time that night, standing over the cot. My son. His son was burning up around it. Creature. The elf was there before the name finished. He took one look and made a sound Regulus had never heard from him. A thin, keen, the sound of an old grief finding a new one to hold hands with. Fetch the black case from under the floor of the sealed room, Regulus said. His voice came out level, which surprised him. the reverse of it, on the third shelf. Not the door. You can't open the door, the wards will kill you. I'll open the door. Just be ready to run when I do. He opened the door. The thing in the wall was waiting for him, and it was glad. Oh, it was glad. It had felt the child sicken from across the house, and it wanted to watch, and Regulus went past it into the little cursed room with the sound of it feasting on his fear, and he found the black case, and he came out, and he shut the door on the thing's laughter, and he did not think about it again because he did not have room to. What followed was the longest night of his life, and he had spent a night in a cave, letting the dead pull him under, so the competition was not slight. He was not a healer. He was a boy who had been raised in a house full of dark books, and had read all of them, the way another child reads adventure stories. And some of what he had read was cruelty, and some of it was the antidote to cruelty, which the blacks had kept close, because a family that dealt in poison learns early to keep the cures. He knew the shape of what was in his son's chest. It was a fragment, not the whole of the old evil that had died in the cottage in the west, but a splinter of it, lodged in the child on the night the rest came apart, sleeping until now, waking now for reasons Regulus could not fathom and did not have time to. He could not cut it out. It was woven into his son too finely. It had had 16 months to grow roots, but it could be quieted, it could be put back to sleep, and the putting back to sleep was old black work, patient and exacting. The drawing of runes in a particular order on a particular skin, the speaking of words in a language that predated kindness, the offering, this was the part that no book made easy, of a portion of the caster's own life to weigh against the darkness and tip the scale. He gave it. He did not weigh how much. He knelt on the cold floor with his burning son across his knees, and he drew the runes with a shaking hand, and he spoke the words, and he poured himself out through them hour after hour, while the sea beat the rocks outside, and Creature held the lamp, and Hermione, woken by the string that ran between her and the lad, sat in the doorway in her nightgown, silent, refusing every command to go back to bed, keeping her own kind of watch. Toward dawn the fever broke. It broke all at once, the way ice breaks, with a small sound and then a great giving way. The dark bloom under Harry's skin drew back into the scar and thinned and paled and slept. Harry's breathing lengthened. His skin cooled. He turned his hot, damp head against Regulus's chest and made a disgruntled noise, the ordinary noise of an ordinary sleeping child, and Regulus, who had not moved in 6 hours, bent his head over him and did not weep, because blacks did not, but sat so still and so long that Creature at last took the lamp from his hand, for fear he would drop it. Hermione came across the floor. She had been told a dozen times to stay in the doorway, and she had, but the doorway's authority had now expired, and she crossed the room in her nightgown with her rabbit dangling, and she climbed up beside Regulus without asking, which she had never done, and she put one small hand flat on Harry's back to feel him breathe, and having confirmed it, she leaned the whole weight of her against Regulus's arm and went to sleep sitting up. Regulus sat between the two of them in the gray dawn light, with the sea quieting outside, and the thing in the wall gone sullen and silent, cheated of its show. And he understood that whatever he had been before the cave, a boy, a follower, a coward, a corpse that had failed to stay dead, he was now something with a shape, and the shape was this: a man with 2 children asleep against him and a promise between his teeth that he would not, whatever it cost, let go. He had given years of his life that night. He could feel the absence of them, a thinness at the center of himself, like a coat with the lining cut out. He did not regret it. He filed it, no. He did not file it anywhere. He simply held it, the fact of what he had spent and what he had bought with it, and found the exchange fair. Creature covered all 3 of them with the blue blanket, which had been Hermione's, and which was now, by the wordless treaty of small children, everyone's. Then the elf sat down against the far wall to watch over the lot of them, and the cottage at Kittiwake held its breath around them, and outside the long winter went on, indifferent and enormous, and did not yet end. The nearest thing to a village was a place called Sorn, 4 miles along the coast road, and Regulus went there when he had to, and no more often. It was the kind of village that had watched the world come and go for 600 years and formed no strong opinions about any of it, a shop that sold everything, a church nobody attended, and a churchyard everybody ended in, a harbor with 3 boats, and, at the top of the one steep street, a woman named Effie Ross who kept goats and grudges in roughly equal number, and who was the first person outside the cottage to guess that Regulus Black was not what he claimed to be. He claimed to be a widower. It was the story that asked the fewest questions. A young man alone with 2 small children in a hard house on a hard coast, come north to be away from a grief he did not care to discuss. People are gentle with that story, or leave it alone, which in the country is the same as gentle. He had chosen it in 5 minutes, and it had served him for months, and it broke against Effie Ross in the space of a single conversation over a dozen eggs. "Widower," she said, weighing the word along with the eggs. She was perhaps 70, and built like a fence post, and she had eyes that had spent a lifetime telling weather from sky. Aye, and the wee one's mother, what took her? Fever, Regulus said. He had a whole grief prepared and did not enjoy using it. Effie set the eggs in his basket one at a time, not looking at him. My man was a fisherman. 40 years I watched that water. You learn the look of a person who's lost somebody to a thing they can name. A fever, a boat, a fall. She looked at him then, once, straight through. You've not got that look. You've the other one. The look of a body that's lost something they're not allowed to say out loud. Different look entirely. Regulus said nothing. It was, he had found, the strongest thing a man could say in most situations, and Effie Ross seemed to think so too, because she nodded, taking his silence for confirmation, and went back to the eggs. I'll not ask, she said. I've buried enough people to know the difference between a secret that hurts folk and a secret that only hurts the one keeping it. You've the second kind. It's written all over you, along with the not sleeping. She tied off the basket. The bairns are fed and warm, and the wee lass corrected my grammar last week, so you're doing the important parts. Bring them up the hill Thursday. The nanny goats had kids. Children should see something be born that lives. Too much of the world shows them the other thing. So it was that on a Thursday in the thin edge of spring, Regulus Black, heir of one of the oldest and darkest families in wizarding Britain, a man with a splinter of the greatest evil of the age sealed in his cottage wall, stood in a muddy byre and watched his 2 children meet a pair of newborn goats, and understood that he had made, without meaning to, an ally. Harry was frightened of the goats for exactly as long as it took to discover that they were also frightened of him, whereupon he became their devoted persecutor and had to be extracted from the byre backwards, roaring. Hermione approached the whole business as a research problem. She wanted to know why the kids could stand up so soon when Harry, who was older, still fell over, and Effie Ross, who did not talk down to children because she had never in her life talked down to anyone, told her the true and complicated answer at some length, and Hermione listened to all of it with her whole small face and then asked a follow-up question, so sharp that the old woman laughed for the first time in Regulus's hearing. That one, Effie said to Regulus, watching Hermione interrogate a goat, is going to be trouble to somebody. I hope you've the sense to be glad of it and not the folly to try and stop it. I've been told, Regulus said, that a question is the bravest thing a person can carry. Effie Ross looked at him sidelong. Told or telling? He did not answer that either. But he brought the children up the hill again the Thursday after, and one after that, and the beer and the goats and the fence post woman with her weather eyes became a fixed point in the small revolving world of that first winter, a place the children could be children in the ordinary muddy way, unhunted, safe under a lie that a wise old muggle had seen straight through and chosen, for reasons of her own, to keep. The danger, when it finally came near, did not come from the sea or the village or the thing in the wall. It came, as Regulus had always known it eventually would, from his own world, wearing lime green robes and an expression of official concern. There was a knock at the cottage door in March. Regulus did not get knocks at the cottage door. The house sat behind a Fidelius he had cast himself, his own secret kept in his own head. A person could stand on the doorstep and see only rock and gorse and gray water, unless Regulus had told them the words that let the house exist for them, and he had told no one. And yet, at 4 o'clock on a raw March afternoon, someone knocked. He put Harry down. He moved Hermione behind him with one hand, a gesture she suffered because his voice when he did it was a voice she had learned to obey. The flat cold one with no Y in it at all. He took his wand out of his sleeve, and he opened the door on a small, harried, official-looking witch with a clipboard and a satchel and mud to the knees, who looked up at him and said, "Oh, thank Merlin, I thought I'd walked into the sea. Mr." She consulted the clipboard. "There's no name. There's never a name at this one. Are you is this a registered address for a magical child? I have a trace flag. 2, actually. Underage magic. Unregistered location. I'm from the improper use office. We don't prosecute the little ones, obviously. It's just the flags have been going off up here for months and nobody could find the place. And today the wind changed and I could suddenly see your chimney, so here I am." Regulus stood in the doorway of the impossible house with his wand hidden along his wrist and his heart going like a hunted animal's. And he made, in the space of a breath, the coldest calculation of his life. She was alone. She was young. She was tired and wet, and she had walked 4 miles up a coast road on a flag that any competent officer would have handed to a superior, which meant she was junior and overlooked and doing a thing nobody had asked her to do because she was the sort of person who could not leave a thing undone. He could take her memory. It would be easy and clean, and she would wake at the bottom of the hill believing she had gotten turned around, and the cottage would go back to being invisible. Behind him, Hermione said, "Who is it?" And the young witch's face, at the sound of the child's voice, did a thing that decided the matter. It softened. Not professionally, not the practiced softness of a woman doing a job. It simply softened, the way a face softens when a person who genuinely likes children hears one, and Regulus, who had spent his whole life reading faces for the knife behind them, saw that there was no knife. He lowered the wand. Not visibly. But he let go of the spell he had been holding ready, and it cost him something to do it, because the training of his whole life screamed against it. "It's a person who's very lost and very wet," he told Hermione over his shoulder. And to the witch, "You'd better come in before you fall in the sea. Wipe your feet. The girl will notice if you don't." Her name was Tonks. No, that came later. Her name was Paget, Junior Officer Paget, and she was 24 and hopeless and kind. And she came into the cottage and drank the tea creature brought her without once remarking on the elf, which Regulus noted, because a certain kind of person cannot see a house elf without either sneering or fussing, and Paget did neither. She simply thanked it did. She simply thanked it. She played a game of dubious rules with Harry involving a wooden spoon. She let Hermione explain the entire life cycle of a goat to her without interrupting once, and she looked at Regulus over the children's heads with an expression that had traveled some distance from official towards sad, and she said quietly, when the children were occupied, "You're hiding." "Yes," Regulus said. There was no profit in lying to someone who had already seen it. "From the Ministry?" "From several things. The Ministry is not the worst of them." Paget turned her teacup around in her hands. "The flags will keep going off. Every time the little ones do accidental magic. That's how I found you, and I'm the least dangerous person who could have. Someone else will come. Maybe someone who..." She glanced at Harry, at the spoon, at the scar half hidden under his fringe. "Who I'd not want finding you. I know. I could lose the flags." She said it fast before she could think better of it, the way a person confesses. "In the office. The system's a shambles. Half of it's still on paper from the war. Nobody would ever... I could just lose them." "This address. Make it so nothing ever comes here again." She looked up at him. "I'd want to know why. Not the details. Just, are they safe with you? The children? Because that's the only thing I'll break the rules for. If they're safe with you, I'll bury this so deep nobody finds it in 100 years. And if they're not, I'll bring the whole department down on this house tonight, and I don't care what you do to me for saying so." Regulus looked at this junior officer, this wet and hopeless and utterly dangerous young woman who had just, without knowing it, put her career and possibly her freedom on the table for two children she had met an hour ago, and he felt something he had no name for, and did not try to find one. "Ask them," he said. So she did, not cleverly. She simply sat down on the floor next to Hermione and said, "Do you like it here?" And Hermione looked at her as though she had asked whether water was wet and said, "It's my house," in a tone of such total unanswerable ownership that Paget laughed and her eyes went bright and she got up off the floor with her decision made. "Right," she said, brushing down her muddy robes. "I was never here. There's no house. If anyone ever asks, the coast road just goes into the sea." At the door she paused. The little boy, the scar. She did not say the name. She was junior and overlooked, but she was not stupid, and she had read the same newspapers as everyone else. He's meant to be with his aunt. There was a fuss a while back when he wasn't. It got very quiet, very fast. People decided he'd been placed somewhere safe and secret for his own protection, and everyone was relieved to stop looking. She met Regulus's eyes. "This is safe and it's secret. So, that's all true, isn't it? I've not lied to anyone. He's somewhere safe and secret." She nodded once, hard, agreeing with herself. "Keep them warm. It's a cruel coast in winter." And she walked out into the gray and down the hill, and the cottage folded shut behind her, and Regulus stood in the doorway a long moment after she had gone, holding the shape of what had just happened, turning it over, waiting for the trick in it. There was no trick. Sometimes it turned out there was no trick. Sometimes a stranger simply chose, and the choosing was the whole of it. He shut the door. Behind him, Harry had climbed onto the table and was conducting the fire with the wooden spoon, and Hermione was telling him he wasn't allowed on the table, and Harry was ignoring her with the serene confidence of the very young, and Creature was pretending to disapprove of all of it while quietly moving the breakable things out of range. "Off the table," Regulus said without heat, and lifted the child down, and his son immediately climbed back up, and the whole ordinary war resumed, and the extraordinary thing that had almost happened folded itself away into the past where it could not hurt them. They had a Christmas that first winter, though Regulus had not planned one and would not have known how. He had grown up with Christmases that were performances of wealth and coldness, gifts given to prove a point and received with the correct restraint. And he had assumed, in the vague way he assumed most things about ordinary life, that he would simply let the day pass unremarked. It was Creature who would not have it. The elf had served 50 years of the family's brittle, glittering Christmases and had, it emerged, hated every one of them, and he had decided that these two children would have a different kind. And he made it happen out of driftwood and foraged holly and a goose, bartered from Effie Ross, and a fierce, unspoken determination that Regulus did not interfere with. Because he could see it mattered to the elf in a way that went down to the root of him. There were no grand gifts. Harry got a spinning top Creature had carved and became so instantly devoted to it that he wept when it stopped spinning, which it did approximately every 4 seconds, so that the whole of Christmas morning was a cycle of joy and despair on a 4-second loop. Hermione, not yet 3, got a single wooden bead on a string, and she examined it with her whole grave face and then spent the day methodically posting it into every container in the house, a project of such total absorption that they found beads. Creature had prudently made a dozen, in the flour and the kettle, and one of Regulus's boots for weeks. And Regulus, who had expected nothing and wanted nothing, was given by 2 children too small to have bought anything, the thing they had, which was themselves, both of them falling asleep on him at once by the fire that first Christmas night. And he sat under their sleeping weight in the firelight in the strange warm ruin of a holiday he had not known how to want, and understood that he had never once, in 20 years, had a Christmas that was not a performance, and that this graceless goose and driftwood one was the first real one of his life. There was a toy, that winter, that mattered more than any toy had a right to. It was a wooden dog, a crude thing, whittled by Creature out of a bit of the settle that had come loose, because the elf could not abide idle hands and had decided the children needed something that was theirs, and not merely inherited from the drowned life of the house. He was no craftsman. The dog had 4 legs of 4 different lengths and an expression that could charitably be called startled. Harry loved it with the whole ferocity of his small heart. He named it, after long deliberation, Dog, and he took it everywhere, and he slept with it, and he fed it porridge, which did the dog no favors. And when Hermione pointed out with unimpeachable logic that Dog was not real and could not eat, Harry looked at her with such wounded betrayal that she never said it again, and in fact took up the fiction herself, and became in time its fiercest defender. Dog lost a leg in February, the shortest one, which had always been doomed. Harry's grief was total and inconsolable and lasted most of the morning, and Regulus, who had faced down Inferi and Death Eaters and a splinter of the Dark Lord's soul, found himself entirely defeated by a one-legged wooden dog and a weeping child, until Hermione, 3 years old and already unable to bear an unsolved problem in her vicinity, marched off, fetched the leg and presented it to Regulus with the air of a surgeon handing over an instrument. "Fix it," she commanded. He could have mended it with a word. He had a wand. It was the work of a second. Instead, for reasons he did not fully understand at the time, and understood completely later, he sat down at the table with the 2 children watching and mended it by hand with a bit of glue Creature found and a splint of matchwood, slowly, badly, letting them help. Letting Harry hold the leg in place and Hermione count to 100 while it set, so that when it was done the dog was theirs, in a way a spell could never have made it. Mended by the family it belonged to. It stood crooked ever after. It stood crooked for years, and "Fix it," in Hermione's flat, commanding 3-year-old voice, became the first true inside joke of that house, a thing they would say to each other over far larger breakages all their lives, a shorthand for, "This is broken and we will mend it together and it will stand crooked and we will love it anyway." By the time the first proper warmth came, and it came late that year, a soft gray week in April when the sea forgot for a while to be a knife, the shape of the family had set, the way a poured thing sets, into something that would hold. They had a life. That was the astonishing part, the part Regulus could not have predicted in the sick dead year before the children came. They had mornings with their own small liturgy, Creature's porridge, which Harry ruined with anything orange he could find, and Hermione ate with a grave correctness of a diplomat at a state dinner. The walk down to the shingle to see what the tide had brought, which was Harry's church and would remain so all his life. The reading hour, which was Hermione's, and during which Harry was permitted to build things out of the driftwood provided he did not narrate. They had afternoons of mud and goats and weather. They had evenings that ended, always, in the same cot, the 2 dark heads on the one pillow, the string between them gone slack and easy in sleep. And they had him. Regulus did not know what he was to them yet. The words were not settled. Hermione called him most often "you" in the imperious way of a small person who has not yet met a stranger she couldn't boss. Harry called him a sound that was not quite a word, "reg," worn down from Regulus by a mouth too small for the whole of it, and Regulus had decided he would answer to it forever. Neither of them had said the other word, the one that named what he was to them, and he did not ask for it, because he had learned in one hard winter that the things worth having could not be asked for, only earned and waited on, and if you were very fortunate and did not deserve it, given. It was given on an ordinary evening in that soft April week. He had a fever of his own, a small one, a cold caught off Effie's grandson at the byre, and he had done the thing he never did, which was to lie down in the daylight on the settle by the fire, meaning to close his eyes for 10 minutes and instead falling into the deep helpless sleep of a body finally out of danger long enough to remember its exhaustion. He woke to wait. Both of them had climbed up onto the settle with him, Harry along his chest, Hermione tucked under his arm with a book, and they had covered him, badly, with the blue blanket, and they had appointed themselves his guard, as he had so many nights been theirs. He kept his eyes shut a moment, feigning sleep, listening. "Is he sick like I was?" Harry in a whisper that was not remotely a whisper. "No, he's just tired." Hermione certain of everything. "He's tired because he stays awake to watch us. I've seen him. He does it every night." A silence while Harry absorbed this large idea. "Who watches him?" Another silence, longer. And then Hermione, 3 years old, with the whole clear, ruthless logic of a child who has decided a thing and will now simply arrange the world to match. "We do. That's what we're for. He's ours. He's ours. Not he has us. Not he keeps us. He's ours." In the same tone of unanswerable ownership she had used on Paget, "It's my house," the tone of a person laying claim to a thing that could not be argued out of her hands. Regulus lay very still under his 2 children and the borrowed blanket, and he did not open his eyes because if he opened them they would see, and a black did not. And he needed the moment more than he needed his pride, which was a sentence he could not have imagined saying a year before. Outside the tide was coming in. Somewhere deep in the house the thing in the wall lay silent, cheated of another day, and on the settle by the fire, in the soft failing light of an April evening on a cruel coast. A man who had gone into a cave to die, held still under the weight of the 2 reasons he had, without meaning to, chosen to live, and let them believe he was asleep, and let them keep their watch. Chapter 1. End. Chapter 2. The Summer of the Long Light. The far north keeps its summer short and pays for them in daylight. In June the dark barely came at all. It thinned to a blue nothing around midnight and gave up entirely by 3, so that the children ran wild on a schedule of their own devising, and Regulus, who had spent the winters teaching them that bedtime was a law of nature, spent the summers watching that law repealed by the sun. Harry was 7 that summer, and Hermione 8, and they had reached the age where they were more trouble awake than asleep, and more trouble asleep than they had any right to be. They had also reached the age of projects. Everything was a project. The shingle beach below the cottage was being surveyed, Hermione's word, for a harbor, which involved the moving of a great many stones from where the sea had put them to where the children thought they ought to be. A labor of Sisyphus that the tide undid every night, and the children resumed every morning without the least discouragement. Harry did the moving. Hermione did the surveying. This division of the world into the ones who lifted and the ones who decided where the lifting went had established itself early and would, Regulus suspected, outlast all of them. He watched from the top of the shingle with a cold cup of tea, the way he watched most things now, from a small distance, keeping the perimeter. 8 years of this coast had weathered him. He was 27 and looked older in the eyes and younger in the hands, which had learned to do 100 domestic things they had never been meant for: plait hair, gut fish, mend a broken toy so it stood crooked. The thinness at his center, the years he had spent on the lad's fever 6 winters past, had never quite filled back in. He tired more easily than a man his age should. He did not mention this to anyone, least of all to himself. Harry, hollering up the beach, holding a stone the size of his own head. "Reg, watch, I can—" "Don't," Regulus said. The child threw the stone. It was a magnificent throw for a 7-year-old and a catastrophic one for anybody standing near where it landed, which was, fortunately, no one, because Hermione had seen it coming the way she saw most things coming, and removed herself with the weary economy of an older sister who has been dodging her brother's enthusiasm since before she could walk. "I said don't," Regulus said. "You watch, though." Harry grinned up at him, gap-toothed. He'd lost 2 that spring and mourned neither. "You said watch and you watched." "I said don't and watch. In that order. The order matters." But there was no iron in it, and Harry knew there was no iron in it, and grinned wider and went to find another stone, and Regulus drank his cold tea and did not smile, because he had spent a lifetime not smiling, and the muscles were unreliable, but the thing that would have been a smile happened somewhere behind his face where no one could hold it against him. The haircut happened in July, and it was entirely Regulus's fault, and everyone agreed on this, loudly, for years. Harry's hair had reached a state that not even Regulus, who cared nothing for appearances and had let a good deal slide, could ignore. It stood out from the child's head in all directions at once, a black thundercloud that the sea wind styled hourly into new catastrophes, and it had begun to actively resist the comb, which Regulus was fairly sure was accidental magic, and not merely bad character, though with Harry the line between the two had always been blurred. "It's Potter hair," Effie Ross said, when Regulus mentioned it at the byre. She had known James Potter's father, or someone very like him, in the loose way that old country people know that all men are related if you go back far enough. You'll not tame it. Might as well try to comb the sea. Cut it short and let it be. So Regulus cut it short. He had never cut hair in his life. He had a pair of creature's kitchen scissors and a 7-year-old who would not sit still in a memory, from somewhere in his own gilded and miserable childhood, of a barber doing something with a comb and a confident wrist, and he attempted to reproduce the confident wrist without any of the underlying competence, and the result was a thing that would be spoken of in that house until the end of time. It was not a haircut. It was an event that had happened to a head. One side was shorter than the other by a margin visible from the village. There was a step in the back, a distinct terrace, the hair evidently zoned for development. The fringe, which Regulus had meant to leave long enough to cover the scar, had gone rogue under the scissors and retreated to a height that put the scar on permanent public display, which was the one thing the whole operation had been meant to avoid. Harry looked in the mirror. There was a silence. "I look," Harry said, with the terrible honesty of the young, "like the goats got me." Hermione, who had watched the entire procedure from the doorway with her arms folded and her face a study in prophecy fulfilled, said, "I could have told you." Which was true. She had told him at length before he started, and being right about it was almost worth the disaster. Regulus surveyed his work. A lesser man would have reached for his wand and set it right in a second, and no one would ever have known. He looked at the scissors in his hand, and the terraced head of his son, and the scar now shining out at the world, and he made, for the second time in his son's life, the choice not to use magic on a thing that his hands had done. "It'll grow," he said. "When?" Harry, in despair. "Before you're married." Regulus set down the scissors. "A black," he said, and both children went still, because "a black" was the phrase that meant a rule was coming. One of the old dry laws Regulus handed down like heirlooms, does not hide from a mirror. "You did this. I did this to you, rather, and I'll own it. But you'll wear it like you meant it. Chin up. If anyone in the village asks, you tell them it's the fashion in the South and they're behind the times." Harry considered this. Then he lifted his chin and turned his terraced head this way and that in the mirror, and something in the lad's expression shifted from despair to a dawning delighted villainy. "It is the fashion in the South," he told his reflection. "They're all behind the times." He wore it like a crown for the 6 weeks it took to grow out. He told 3 separate people in Sorn that it was the height of London style. 2 of them believed him. And the scar which Regulus had spent 7 years keeping in shadow sat out in the summer light all that season and drew not one dangerous eye, because it turned out that a scar on a laughing gap-toothed boy with a ridiculous haircut looked like nothing at all, like a boy who'd come off a bicycle, like any child of any coast. And Regulus learned something from that, about hiding, that he turned over for a long time afterward, that the best concealment was sometimes not the shadow but the plain, bright ordinary. He taught them to fly that summer. He had put it off for years, longer than he needed to, and he knew why, and it had to do with a broom that hung on 2 pegs above the cottage door, and had hung there since before the children came. It was a black family broom. Not a racing broom, older than that, and stranger. It had belonged to his uncle Alfred, the one decent man the family had produced in a century, the one who had left Sirius gold enough to buy his freedom and been burned off the tapestry for it. Alfred had left Regulus the broom, in a codicil no one had bothered to contest, because a broom was beneath the notice of people fighting over vaults. It was a long-handled, silver-gray thing, temperamental and proud, and it did not care to be ridden by strangers, and it had thrown Regulus twice in his boyhood before deciding he would do. He took it down from the pegs on a still evening in the long light, and the children went quiet in the way they only ever went quiet for the sharp register, the one Regulus used for the old and dangerous things. And he told them, sitting on the shingle with the broom across his knees, a little of what a broom was in a family like his. "This isn't a toy," he said. "You've heard me say that about the scissors and the good knife and the far rocks, and you didn't believe me about any of them, and you were mostly right not to. Believe me about this. A broom knows who's riding it. This one has known blacks for 200 years. It will carry you because you're mine." He did not stop on the word, though both children heard it. The first time he had claimed them out loud in the plain flat register he used for true things. "But it will drop you the instant you're careless, because that is what it was made to do in a family where carelessness got people killed. So you will not be careless. Not once. Not to show off, Harry, not to prove a theory, Hermione. Do we understand each other?" "Yes," they said, in the rare unison they produced only when they were frightened or delighted, and they were both. He taught Hermione first, because Hermione would not get on the thing until she understood it, and understanding it kept her cautious, and cautious was how he wanted them to start. She hovered a foot off the shingle, rigid with concentration, correcting her own grip against instructions he had not finished giving, and she flew like a girl doing a difficult sum, which is to say precisely and without joy, and landed and declared the whole enterprise interesting, which from Hermione was high praise and also a door quietly closing. She would fly when she had to, all her life, and never for pleasure. She had already found her sky, and it was made of books, and it did not throw you. Harry got on the broom, and the broom knew him. There was no other way Regulus could ever describe it, then or after. The silver-gray thing that had thrown him twice, that suffered even its own family with disdain, took the 7-year-old up off the shingle as though it had been waiting 80 years for exactly this rider, and Harry, who could not sit still for a haircut, who threw stones the size of his head, who mourned no lost tooth and feared no goat, when still and certain and right in the air in a way he never was on the ground. He did not show off. Regulus had told him not to, and for once, up there, Harry had no need to. The flying was not a thing he was doing to be seen. It was a thing he was, finally, alone with, and his face when he came down had a piece on it that Regulus recognized with a jolt of cold recognition, because it was his brother's face. It was serious. At that age, on a broom, before everything. It was the black talent surfacing in a half-blood boy on a northern beach. Generations of it. The one clean thing the family had ever done well, and it had found its way to Harry across all that ruin. Regulus watched his son fly in the long midnight light and did not let his face do anything, and thought about his brother and a stone cell across the sea, and said nothing, and took the broom back up when the children were finally protesting, sent to bed, and stood alone on the shingle holding it a while before he hung it on its pegs. There was a week in July they nearly lost Harry to the far rocks, and it became, once the fright of it had worn off, one of the great legends of that summer, told and retold until it stopped being a thing that had frightened anyone and became simply a thing that had frightened anyone and became simply a thing that had happened, which is the mercy families do for their own bad afternoons. The far rocks were forbidden. That was the whole appeal. They sat off the north point where the tide ran hard, a black tumble of them uncovered only at the lowest water, and Regulus had told the children a dozen times in the sharp register that they were not to go out to them because the tide came back across the flats faster than a person could run and had taken grown fishermen who thought they knew it. Harry, being 7 and being Harry, heard forbidden as interesting, and one low afternoon while Hermione was surveying and Regulus was up at the beer, he went out to the far rocks to see what was on them, and what was on them was a stranded seal pup, and Harry, whose whole heart led him always, sat down beside the frightened animal to keep it company and lost track of the water. It was Hermione who saved him, and she did it with a calculation and not a rescue, which was the most Hermione thing about the whole affair. She looked up from her surveying, saw where he'd gone, saw the tide already turning across the flats, and did not run out after him, because she had done the sum in the space of a breath. And the sum said that 2 children on the far rocks drowned better than 1. Instead, she ran the other way up the shingle, screaming for Regulus with a voice that carried the 400 yards to the byre, and she kept her eyes on Harry the whole time and shouted the tide's progress at him across the water. "It's at the 3rd rock, Harry. It's at the 2nd. Move," feeding him the data he needed to save himself while she fetched the one person who could reach him. And between her arithmetic and Harry's flat-out terrified splashing flats and Regulus arriving at a dead sprint who could reach him, and between her arithmetic and Harry's flat-as wabblet, that Regulus had been angrier that afternoon than the children ever saw him, before or after. And the anger had been the thin, bright kind that is made entirely of fear, and he had said things about the far rocks that Harry never forgot and never disobeyed again. But that night, when the fright had settled, he had sat on the floor between their beds as he always did, and he had said to Hermione, quietly, "You didn't run out to him. You did the sum and you ran for me instead. That was the right thing. That was the hardest right thing there is, to not run toward the person you love when running toward them would only add you to the drowning. Most grown adults can't do it. You did it at 8. And Hermione had said, small, I didn't want to. I wanted to run to him. The sum just said not to. And Regulus had said, that's what courage is. It's not being afraid. It's doing the sum when everything in you wants to throw the sum away. And it was the same lesson she would spend the rest of her life living. First on a beach at 8, and then in a war, and then in a ministry she'd remake. The courage that was made of arithmetic and love in equal measure. And she learned it that July from a stranded seal pup and a turning tide. Old Tam Sinclair died in August, and that was the summer the children learned what a funeral was. They had known about death. You could not raise children on a coast that took fishermen and not have the fact of it in the house. They had buried a goat that spring with full honors, and Hermione had asked the question she asked about everything, and Regulus had answered them plainly, without softening, because he did not believe in lying to children about the one thing every child eventually has to know. But a goat was a goat. Tam Sinclair was a person, an old bent fisherman with a laugh like a rusted hinge who had given Harry a real fishhook the summer before, over Regulus's objection, and taught him to tie a knot with it, and Harry had worn the hook on a string around his neck ever since, and would not be parted from it. Tam died in his boat, in his sleep, at anchor, which the village agreed was as good a death as the water offered and better than most. And the village did the thing villages do, it gathered. And Effie Ross came down to the cottage the evening before and told Regulus, in the flat way she told him the important things, that the children should come. They knew him, she said. He'd want them there. And they're old enough to see it done right. There's a wrong way to meet death, and a right way, and the right way is with your neighbors, in the daylight with your good coat on. Bring them. I'll stand with them a few things to do. So they went. Regulus put the children in the best clothes they owned, which were not very good, and combed Harry's hair, which had grown back into its thundercloud and defied the comb as ever, and they walked the 4 miles to Sorn in the gray August morning, and they stood in the little churchyard among people who had known each other for 80 years, and they watched an old man put into the ground. Hermione held Regulus's hand very hard the whole time and asked no questions, which frightened him more than any question could have, because Hermione's questions were how she kept the world at bay, and their absence meant the world had gotten through. Harry did not hold anyone's hand. He stood very straight, chin up, the way Regulus had taught him for the haircut and for everything since. And he had the fishhook out of his shirt and closed in his fist, and when the first earth went down he made a sound. One, small, and swallowed. And then he did not make another. Afterward there was tea in the village hall, and the strange, bright talk that follows a burial, and the children were fussed over by old women who smelled of lavender and grief, and Effie Ross sat them down in a corner with a plate of something and stayed with them, and Regulus stood a little apart, at the perimeter, keeping watch as he always did, and found the whole ritual working on him in a way he had not braced for. He had not been to a funeral since his own family stopped inviting him to things, which was to say since he was 16 and had begun, quietly, to become the person who would go into the cave. He had never buried anyone. His mother had died while he was in hiding, and he had read about it 3 days late in a salt-stained paper, and his father before that, and he had grieved neither because there had been nothing between them worth grieving, and he had taught himself, young, not to want the thing they would not give. And Sirius was not dead, but might as well have been, walled up in stone with the Dementors for a crime Regulus knew with a certainty that woke him some nights, his brother had not committed. He stood at the edge of Tam Sinclair's funeral tea and understood that he had never let himself mourn anyone, and that a person who cannot mourn is a person who has quietly agreed that nothing he loses will matter, and that he had made that agreement long ago in self-defense, and that the 2 children in the corner had voided it without asking his permission. He could mourn now. That was what the children had done to him, among the other things. They had given him back the capacity to lose, which was a terrible gift, and the only one worth having. On the walk home, Harry said, out of a long silence, Does everyone die? Yes, Regulus said. He would not lie about it. You? Yes. Harry walked a while with that. The road went up along the cliff, and the sea was flat and bright below them, and gulls hung on the wind without moving. Not soon, Harry said. It was not a question. It was an instruction, a demand laid on the universe by a boy who had just learned the universe took things and did not mean to let it take this one. Not soon. You have to. You said before you're married. My hair. You said before I'm married. So you have to be there for that. That's a rule now. Regulus looked down at the top of the thundercloud head walking beside him, at the fishhook back on its string, at his son laying down laws against death on a cliff road, because he had no other weapon and would use the one he had. Before you're married, Regulus agreed. It's a rule. I'll hold to it. It was a promise he had no power to keep, and he made it anyway, flatly, in the register he kept for the true ones. And Harry nodded, satisfied. The matter closed. The universe informed of its obligations, and Hermione, on Regulus's other side, who had said nothing the whole walk, slipped her hand back into his and held it the rest of the way home, and he understood that she had heard the promise and knew it for what it was, a thing said out of love and not out of power, and had decided, at 8, to let her brother have it anyway, because some kindnesses are worth more than the truth. She was going to be, he thought, a formidable and complicated woman. She already was a formidable and complicated child. The sealed room nearly gave up its secret that summer, and it was Hermione, of course, who nearly found it, because Hermione found everything eventually. It was only ever a question of when. She had been mapping the house. It was one of her projects. She was always mapping something, the beach, the beer, the tide tables, and the house was the great unfinished work, because the house did not add up. She had measured it. She had actually measured it, pacing the rooms heel to toe and keeping a tally in a notebook Creature had bound for her out of brown paper, and she had discovered that the house was larger outside than in. There was a room's worth of space, on the seaward side of the passage that the inside of the house did not account for, and Hermione at 8 found this the single most interesting fact in the world and would not let it go. There's a room, she told Regulus, presenting her notebook with the grave authority of an inspector serving a summons. Here, see. The passage is too short. There's a whole room and there's no door, and I want to know why. Regulus looked at the notebook. She had drawn the house to scale. She had drawn the missing space and shaded it and put a question mark in it, and the question mark sat exactly, precisely, over the stone behind which the lock had slept and hated. And the sight of his 8-year-old daughter's careful pencil question mark hovering over the worst thing in the world put a cold straight through him that he did not let reach his face. He had known this day would come. He had not thought it would come at 8, from a brown paper notebook. But he had known Hermione would find the gap in the house, as she found the gap in everything, and he had, somewhere in the back of himself, prepared for it. There's a room, he agreed. He would not lie to her. A lie to Hermione was a debt that always came due with interest, and worse, she would know. You're right, you measured it right. You're always right about the measuring. He set the notebook down, and I'm going to ask you to leave it, and I'm going to tell you why, because you're owed the why. You're always owed the why. I promised you that when you were 2, and I meant it. Hermione went still. The sharp register did that to her. There's a thing in that room, Regulus said, that I put there before you came, and that I keep there because it's dangerous and because I haven't yet found how to be rid of it. It can't get out. I've made certain of that with everything I have, and I check it, and it can't get out. But it's the one thing in this house I can't make safe, and so it's the one thing you can't help me with. And you're going to hate that, because you help me with everything, and I'm sorry. When you're older, I'll tell you all of it. Not a story. The truth, the whole of it, however ugly. I'll owe it to you, and I'll pay it. But not at 8. At 8, I need you to trust me that there's a door I've kept shut for a reason, and to keep shut with me, and not to measure it again. It was the longest and most honest thing he had ever said to her, and he watched it land, watched her turn it over with the terrible thoroughness she turned everything over with, watched her weigh I want to know against he has never lied to me, and come, slowly, reluctantly, to the second. When I'm older, she said, fixing it, making it a rule, the way Harry made rules against death. You'll tell me all of it. That's a promise. I'm writing it down. And she opened the brown paper notebook and wrote, in her careful 8-year-old hand, Reg will tell me about the room when I am older. He promised, Og. And she showed it to him so that he could see it was witnessed and binding. And then she closed the book and did not measure the passage again. She kept her word. It cost her, and she kept it. And Regulus, who had been raised among people who kept no words at all, understood that he was raising something rare, and felt the old cold thing in the wall listening to all of it, and felt for once that he had won that day's small war handily because the girl had chosen him over her own devouring curiosity. And there was no darker magic than that, and no cleaner. The magic came harder that summer, in both of them, the way it does when children cross out of littleness into whatever comes next. With Harry, it was loud. He wanted the thing, and the thing came to him, across a room, off a high shelf, out of a locked box. He was frightened, and the frightening thing flew backward off the beach and into the sea. He laughed too hard and the lamps flared. It was undisciplined and generous and entirely without malice, and it frightened Regulus more than a cruel child's magic would have. Because generous power is the hardest kind to teach restraint to. You cannot tell a warm-hearted boy to be careful of his own warmth. You can only stand near him and catch what he throws. With Hermione, it was quiet and exact and, in its way, far stranger. She did not wish things across rooms. She corrected them. A thing was wrong and she looked at it and it was less wrong. A knot Harry had tangled came undone under her stare. A page torn in a book she loved knitted itself back along the tear while she frowned at it, not because she had willed it whole, but because she could not abide it broken and the magic in her, obedient to that stronger law, simply did what she could not stand to leave undone. Regulus watched her mend the torn page without touching it and understood that he was raising something the wizarding world did not have a comfortable word for, a muggle-born child with a will like a blade, and that the world would try very hard, when it got hold of her, to teach her that people like her were lucky to be let in at all, and that he had perhaps 4 years to arm her against that lie before it reached her. He wrote to Paget about the trace. He had an owl now, a bad-tempered thing called Nettle, who despised everyone and delivered anyway, and a small, careful correspondence with the junior officer who had buried the cottage's address years before, the only line he kept open to his own world. She came north twice a year when she could, and she came that August, muddy and cheerful as ever, and she sat on the shingle and let Harry demonstrate his magnificent uncontrolled magic by launching pebbles into the sea with his mind, and her face, watching him, was not cheerful at all. "He's strong," she said to Regulus slow, while Hermione conscripted Harry into surveying. "That's not a 7-year-old's strength. The trace on this house would be screaming if I hadn't gagged it, and even gagged, I felt that from the bottom of the hill." She turned her teacup in her hands, the old nervous habit. There are people who can feel it too, not many. But the war left things behind Regulus, not just the ones in Azkaban. There are people still out there who spent years learning to smell power like his because their master paid them to, and some of them are still hungry. And a boy like that on an empty coast is a lamp in the dark to the right kind of moth. "I know," Regulus said. He knew better than she did. He had been one of the moths once in the years he did not talk about. "Can you teach him to bank it? Turn it down?" "Not yet. He's too young to have the discipline and too warm to want it. In a few years." He looked down the beach at the lad, arms flung wide, laughing, sending a spray of pebbles skittering across the water like a thrown handful of stars. "You don't teach a fire not to burn. You teach it where the hearth is. That takes time, and it takes him wanting a hearth to keep it in, and he does, now. That's the whole of my strategy, if you want it plainly. I've made them love the house so much that when the time comes, I can teach them to protect it, because protecting it will mean protecting each other, and they'd do anything for each other. The magic will follow the love. It always does. It's the only lever I've got, and I've spent 7 years setting it." Paget looked at him a while. "That's either the wisest thing I've ever heard a parent say," she said, "or the most frightening, and I honestly can't tell which." "Both," Regulus said. "It's a black raising them. It was never going to be only one." They asked him, that summer, where they came from. It was Harry who asked, because Harry asked things straight out that Hermione had already worked halfway to on her own and was only waiting for confirmation of. They were older now. The question was bound to come. Regulus had known it would, and had rehearsed 100 versions of the answer and used none of them when the moment came, because the moment came at the wrong time, as the true moments always do, at the end of an ordinary evening with the lamps low, and both children meant to be asleep. "Reg." Harry's voice from the small room, carrying. "Reg, what were our mums and dads?" Regulus set down the book he was not reading. Creature at the hearth went very still and did not turn around. He went and sat on the floor between their 2 beds, which they still, at 7 and 8, pushed together most nights, the string between them stronger than any command he gave about sleeping apart. And he told them the truth, or as much of the truth as 7 and 8 could carry, which was more than most adults credited children with and less than the whole. "Your mother and father," he said to Harry, "were called James and Lily Potter. They were brave. They died protecting you, both of them, standing between you and a very bad man, and they did it because they loved you more than they loved staying alive, which is the bravest thing anyone can do, and the hardest, and you should know it about them. Always. You come from people who stood in front of the thing that was coming. That's your blood. Don't ever let anyone tell you it's anything less." Harry was quiet. "Then, did you know them?" "No," Regulus said. "I wish I had. I'd have liked your father, I think. Everyone did." That was true, and it cost him, because everyone did, included his own brother, who had loved James Potter like the brother he should have had, the brother Regulus had failed to be. And me? Hermione, small from the dark. She had learned young not to expect her story to be as grand as Harry's. The world had already begun, in 100 small ways, teaching her that a muggle-born story counted for less, and Regulus heard the bracing in her voice, the readiness to be told she came from nothing, and he set out to break it. "Your mother and father were called the Grangers," he said. "They were dentists. Do you know what that is?" They were healers, of a kind. They mended people's teeth, which sounds small until you've had a toothache, and then it's the whole world. They were muggles. They had no magic at all, not a drop, and they made you who has more of it than any child I've ever seen, and that is not a smaller thing than what Harry comes from. That's a larger thing. Harry comes from a long line of magic, generations of it, and it was always going to find him. You come from nowhere. From two kind people who fixed teeth and never knew what you were, and the magic came to you anyway, out of nothing, because the universe wanted you to have it and would not be told no. Do you understand the difference? He inherited a river. You are a spring. Nobody gave you what you have. It rose up out of you because you're you. Don't ever let anyone in the world you're going into tell you that makes you less. It makes you the rarer thing. There was a long silence in the small room. Then Hermione said in a very small voice, "How did they die?" "My mom and dad." And here Regulus did not tell the whole truth, because the whole truth was a burned house and a shed and a day and a night alone. And she was 8, and there are truths that are owed and truths that are owed and truths that are only cruelty in a truth's clothing. And he had learned to tell them apart. "Bad men," he said, "the same kind of war that took Harry's parents. It was very quick, and it was not your fault. And there was nothing you could have done, and you should know that last part especially, because a child who loses her parents always, somewhere, wonders if she could have stopped it, and you couldn't have, no one could have. You were a baby, and it was a war, and wars take people who did nothing to deserve it. That's the worst thing about them. When you're older, I'll tell you more if you want it. Some of it's hard, but the shape of it is this. You were loved, and then you were lost. And then I found you in the cold, and I have never once, not for a single day, been sorry that I did. Do you hear me? Not one day." He heard her turn over in the dark. He heard the small sounds of Harry moving closer to her, the string between them going taut, Harry doing the thing he always did when his sister was hurt, which was to put himself near her without a word. And then Hermione said, into the dark, the question he had been waiting 8 years for and had never once figured out how he would answer. "What are you then?" "To us." Regulus sat on the floor between the two beds in the low lamplight, and Creature stood frozen at the hearth, and the whole house seemed to lean in for it. Even, perhaps, the thing in the wall. "I don't know what the word is," he said finally, "because it was the truth and they were owed the truth. I'm not your father. Your fathers were James Potter and Mr. Granger, and they were good men, and you don't replace those. But I'm the one who's here. I'm the one who'll be here. I'm the one who cut your hair badly and taught you to fly, and buried the goat and will bury me before I let anything happen to either of you. Whatever that is. Whatever you want to call the person who does those things. That's what I am to you. You can pick the word. You've time. There's no hurry on it." Silence. And then Harry, sleepily, with the total unbothered certainty of a boy who had solved the problem years ago and was only surprised the adults were still working on it. "You're Reg." "Yes," said Regulus. "That's the word." A yawn, enormous, final. "Hermione, it's Reg. Go to sleep." And Hermione, after a moment, in a voice that had let go of something and taken up something better, "All right, Night Reg." "Night Reg." "Good night," Regulus said, and got up off the floor, and stood a moment looking down at the two of them already sliding into sleep, the string slack and easy between them, and then he went out and shut the door most of the way, leaving the lamp crack they still liked, and he found Creature at the hearth with his enormous eyes swimming and pretending furiously that they were not. "Not a word," Regulus told the elf. Creature was going to say nothing, Creature said, with immense dignity, and blew his nose on a tea towel, and said nothing at great and dignified length for the rest of the evening. A storm came up out of the west in the last week of August, the first real one of the turning year, and it taught Regulus a thing about his two children that he had half known and never seen proven. It came at night, fast, the way the western storms did, the wind going from nothing to a scream in the space of an hour, and the sea throwing itself at the cottage with a sound like a siege. The children had never minded storms. They had been born, in a sense, into one. And the cottage had held through worse, but this one had thunder in it, close thunder, the kind that arrives with the light and the noise together so that there is no counting the gap. And Harry, who feared no goat and no height and no funeral, was afraid of the thunder. He always had been. It was his one fear, and he was ashamed of it, which made it worse. And on the night of the big August storm, it got hold of him completely. And Regulus came into the small room to find the child rigid and white under the blankets, with his hands over his ears and his eyes squeezed shut. But he was not alone, and he was not the one Regulus needed to help, because Hermione was already there. She had heard the thunder wake her brother, the string, always the string, and she had climbed into his bed without being asked and taken his hands down from his ears and was holding them, both of them, in both of hers, and she was talking to him, low and steady and relentless, and Regulus stopped in the doorway and listened and did not interfere, because what she was doing was better than anything had, and that's why she was saying, "It can't hurt you, because the light comes first and the sound comes after, and the sound is just the air. It's just the air falling back into the space the light burned through. It's already over by the time we hear it. Do you understand? By the time you hear the thunder, the dangerous part already happened somewhere else and missed us. So every time you hear that means it missed. The thunder is the sound of it missing. It's the sound of us being safe. And Harry's breathing was slowing and hers hands had Genensits. So it had cared. And had was as without it. Say it, she instructed him. The thunder is the sound of it missing, Harry repeated, shaky. Again. When the next one comes. Say it with the next one. The next one came, a crack that shook the glass, and both children said it together into the noise, the sound of it missing, and Harry flinched and held on and said it, and the thunder rolled off eastward, missing. Always missing. And Hermione nodded once, fierce and satisfied. A general who has the line. Regulus stood in the doorway and understood that he'd been wrong about something. He had thought for 8 years that he was the one keeping them safe, that he stood the perimeter, that the whole architecture of their safety ran through him. And it did, but it ran through them too, through the string between them, and on the night he could do nothing about. Because you cannot reason a boy out of thunder, and Regulus had tried, with logic, with presence, with a hand on the shoulder, and none of it had ever worked. On that night it was the girl who did what he could not, because she had a thing he did not have, which was that she was Harry's, in the way Harry was hers, and the fear that would not yield to a guardian yielded to a sister. He did not go in. That was the hard part and the right part. He stood in the doorway until the storm rolled off and the two of them slept, tangled, Harry's fear spent and Hermione's arms still around him. And then he pulled the blanket up over the both of them and went out to the settle and sat up the rest of the night keeping his own watch, the outer perimeter, the one they didn't need to know about, while inside the small room the inner perimeter held, the one that would outlast him, the one he had spent 8 years building, what understanding that it was the only fortification, that it was the only ought. In the morning the storm had taken half the harbor as he'd said it would, and Harry did not mention the thunder, and Hermione did not mention it either, and it became one more thing that had happened in the dark and belonged to the two of them, filed among the private treaties of their childhood, and Regulus never spoke of it, and neither did they, and it bound them all three the tighter for going unspoken. The long light began to fail at the end of August, the dark creeping back a minute a night, and with it came the knowledge, unspoken between them, that the wild, loose summer was ending, and the shape of the year would tighten again toward winter. They went up to Effie's the last Thursday before the school year would have started, if the children had gone to any school, which they did not. Regulus taught them himself. Hermione racing ahead of every lesson, and Harry learning best on his feet, and both of them ungovernable by any timetable but their own. Effie had lost weight that summer. Regulus noticed it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. And Effie noticed him noticing and gave him a look that told him to keep saying nothing, which he did. The nanny's kids are grown, she told Harry, who had come as always, straight for the goats. That one there, the terror, that's the one you saw born. First spring you came. Look at the size of it now. Harry looked at the grown goat, a rangy, cynical, head-butting beast that bore no resemblance to the wet, startled thing he half remembered, and was visibly moved by the philosophy of it. It got big, he said. Everything does, said Effie Ross, that lives. And she said it to Harry, but she looked at Regulus when she said it, and Regulus understood that she was telling him something, in her flat, weather-eyed way, about the weight she'd lost and the winter coming. And he understood that she knew he understood, and neither of them said any more about it, because that was the treaty between them and always had been. On the way out, Hermione stopped at the beer gate, which had sagged all summer on a broken hinge, and looked at it with the particular frown that meant a problem had been detected. It's broken, she informed Effie. It is. Fix it, said Hermione to Regulus. Deadpan, the old joke, the family password, and Harry laughed so hard he had to sit down in the mud, and even Effie's rusted-hing face cracked into something like a smile, and Regulus took out his wand in front of the old muggle woman who had known for 8 years exactly what he was, and never once said so, and mended the gate with a flick, and hung it true, and Effie watched him do it, without the smallest surprise. Handy, was all she said. Should have had you up here years ago. That gate's been broken since my Donald died. And she let them out through the mended gate into the last of the summer and waved them down the hill, a spare figure against the long light, and Regulus did not know it was the last time the children would see her upright and well, but he suspected, and he made Harry turn and wave again, and he was glad afterward that he had. They marked the turn without meaning to, on the last warm evening, all of them down on the shingle where the summer had mostly happened. The half-built harbor was still there. The stones the children had moved all season, defeated nightly by the tide and rebuilt daily out of pure stubbornness, and it had reached, by August, an actual shape. A low, curved arm of stone reaching out into a pool that held its water now even at low tide, so that the thing the children had willed into being had against the sea's every effort. Come partway true. It works, Harry said, standing in the pool their harbor made, water to his knees, the fishhook bright on its string. Reg, Hermione, it actually works. The water stays. It'll not last the winter, Regulus said, because it wouldn't. The first big storm would take it, and he did not believe in letting him expect otherwise. I know, Hermione from the top of the shingle, notebook on her knees, unbothered. She had known from the start it wouldn't last. She had done the calculations. She had built it anyway, which was the thing about Hermione that the calculations never quite explained. We'll build it again next summer. Bigger. I've worked out where the stones want to go. She looked up, and the failing light was on her face, and she was 8 and formidable and entirely herself. That's what it's for, not to last, to build again. Regulus stood at the top of the shingle with his 2 children below him in the last of the summer, his son in the water and the girl with her notebook, and the tide already turning to take their harbor, and he thought that she had said, without knowing it, the truest thing about the whole enterprise of raising them, that none of it would last, that the summers were short and the light was borrowed and the sea took everything back in the end, and that you built anyway, again and again. Bigger time, not because it would last, but the thing was the only thing was the whole of the thing. He did not say any of this. He said, "Come up out of the water, you'll freeze." And Harry came, dripping, and Hermione closed her book, and the 3 of them walked up the shingle toward the cottage where Creature had the lamps lit and the supper on, and behind them the sea came in gray and quiet, and took the harbor stone by stone, and would give the stones back in the spring, and the children would build it again, bigger, exactly as she had said. Chapter 2, End. Chapter 3, The Year the Letters Came. The first owl arrived at breakfast, and the second one broke a window. Regulus had been expecting them for weeks, which did nothing to prepare him for the reality of 2 Hogwarts owls converging on a cottage that had spent a decade being invisible. The first came down the chimney, which no owl in its right mind would attempt, scattering soot across the porridge and depositing a heavy cream envelope in the exact center of Hermione's bowl before departing in a state of high dudgeon. The second denied the chimney, took the more direct route through the seaward window, and Creature spent the rest of the morning muttering over the broken pane and the general collapse of standards, while the 2 children sat frozen at the table with identical envelopes in front of them, addressed in green ink in a hand that had been writing this same sentence for 1,000 years. Miss H. J. Granger, The Small Bedroom, Kittiwake Cottage by Sorn. Mr. H. J. Potter, The Small Bedroom, Kittiwake Cottage by Sorn. They knew what the letters were. Of course they knew. Regulus had told them years ago that this day would come, had described the school and its houses and its moving stairs in the careful measured way he described everything, neither building it up nor tearing it down, giving them the world as it was and letting them make of it what they would. But knowing a thing is coming and holding it in your hands with your name on it in green ink are different countries, and the 2 of them sat in the second country now, not opening the letters, looking at their names. "They know where we live," Harry said. He did not sound frightened. He sounded like a boy who had just discovered that the invisible walls of his whole life had a door in them and could not decide whether he was glad. "Reg, they wrote where the bedroom is. They know. They always know," Regulus said. "It's the one thing the school has never gotten wrong in 1,000 years. Every magical child in Britain, wherever they're hidden. The quill writes the name the day the child is born, and it waits 11 years, and then the letter comes, and there is no ward and no charm and no cave in the world that stops it." He was speaking to Harry, but he was watching Hermione, who had not said a word, who was holding her envelope in both hands with an expression he could not read, and whose stillness worried him more than any noise. "Open them if you're going to." Hermione opened hers with a precision that would have been funny under other circumstances, sliding a finger into the wax and lifting the seal whole rather than breaking it, because even now, even at the threshold of everything, she could not bear to damage a thing she loved. She read it. She read it twice. And then she set it down flat on the table and pressed it flat with both palms as though it might blow away, and looked up at Regulus, and her whole face was one enormous unspoken question, and the question was, can I? Not can I go? Deeper than that. Can I be it? The thing this letter says I am. Can I be a witch in the real world, out there among them, or is it a mistake? Is it a joke? Will they take one look at where I came from and send me home? 10 years he had spent arming her against exactly this doubt, and here it was anyway. Arrived with the owls, because the world had already taught her in 100 small ways she'd absorbed before he could stop them. That people like her were let in a small ways she absorbed before he hats. Regulus reached across the sooty table and put his hand flat over hers, over the letter, both of them. "You are a spring," he said. It was their old shorthand, from the night he'd told them where they came from, and he watched it land, watched her remember. Nobody gave you this. It rose up out of you. That letter didn't make you a witch, Hermione. It only just now noticed. You've been one your whole life. Now everyone else has to catch up, and some of them will be slow, and some of them will be unkind, and none of it changes the fact that the quill wrote your name 11 years ago, the same as it wrote his, in the same ink, in the same hand, no smaller and no fainter. You belong there exactly as much as anyone who ever walked through those doors. More than most. Do you hear me? She heard him. Her chin came up. The way he taught Harry to lift his over the ruined haircut, and something in her settled and hardened into resolve, and she picked the letter back up and read the list of school things aloud in a clear, steady voice. All business now, already planning, already 3 steps into the future, and Regulus took his hand back and let out a breath he'd been holding for about 11 years. Harry, meanwhile, had opened his letter by tearing the envelope apart like a dog with a parcel, and had read the first line, and had looked up with the whole of his face lit. "There's a castle," he said, as though this settled every question anyone could ever have about anything. "Hermione, it's a castle." The joy lasted the morning. By afternoon, Regulus had to do the thing he'd known he would have to do, and it was the hardest parenting of his life to that point. Harder than the fever, harder than the funeral, and it went badly, as the important things so often did. He had to tell them it might not be possible. Not because of the school. Because of him. Because of the 10 years of hiding and the reasons for it, and the plain brutal arithmetic that sending Harry Potter and Hermione Granger to Hogwarts under their own names meant, within a single day, the end of the secret that had kept all three of them alive. He tried to explain it at the kitchen table with the broken window boarded behind him. He used the sharp register, the one for the old and dangerous things, and they went quiet for it, the way they always did. But quiet was not the same as agreeing, and he could see the disagreement building in Hermione's face line by line as he spoke. When you walk into that school, he said, you walk in as who you are. Harry Potter. The whole of Britain has spent 10 years wondering where you went. The day you appear, it's in every paper in the country by nightfall, and the first question anyone asks is who has been raising him? And the answer to that question is a man the world believes has been dead for 12 years. A man whose family, my family, did terrible things in the war. Do you understand what I'm telling you? The moment you're seen, I'm seen. And there are people who have spent a decade wishing I were as dead as they think I am, and other people who'd want me in Azkaban next to my brother, and I can protect you from a great deal. But I cannot protect you from a whole world that's suddenly looking, all at once, everywhere, for the lad who vanished. Then we go as someone else. Hermione said immediately because she had already solved it, or thought she had. New names. We could be your cousins. We could be. The quill knows your names. The sorting hat knows your names. The wards on the castle read your blood at the gate. You cannot lie your way past Hogwarts, Hermione. It is the one place in Britain that cannot be fooled about who a person is. That's rather the point of it. Then homeschool. You already teach us. You teach us better than I can't teach you what 100 other children teach you. I can't give you a common room. I can't give you the thing Harry needs, which is people his own age who aren't his sister. And the thing you need, which is teachers who know more than I do because I'm clever, Hermione. But I'm one man with a decade-old education and you've already caught me out in charms twice this year and you're 11. He said it plainly. It cost him. You'll outgrow me. Both of you. You're meant to. And I can keep you small and safe on this beach for the rest of your lives, and it would be the most selfish thing I ever did. And I've done some selfish things. The room was very quiet. The boarded window ticked in the wind. And then Harry, who had been silent through all of it, who felt things in his body before he found words for them, stood up from the table so fast his chair went over, and his voice when it came was shaking with something that had been building all afternoon. So, we just don't go? So you keep us here? So we never? He stopped. His hands had curled into fists at his sides and the lamps had begun, very slightly, to flare, the old undisciplined magic rising with the feeling. You said, when Tam died, you said everything that lives gets big. Effie said it. You made me wave at her twice. And now you want to keep us little on this beach forever because you're scared because it's dangerous for you. Harry, Hermione said low. And that's not fair because we never asked to be hidden, we never asked you to. And here Harry's voice cracked clean through because he had arrived at 11 at the terrible ledge underneath all of it, and he went over it before anyone could stop him. We never asked you to give up your whole life for us, and now you're using it like it's our fault, like we owe you being small. The lamps went out, all of them, at once, the child's magic snuffing them in a single furious pulse. And the kitchen dropped into the gray afternoon light from the one unboarded window, and in the sudden dimness Harry stood with his fists clenched, and his chest heaving and his face wet, having said the thing, the unsayable thing, the thing that had been sitting under the whole family for 10 years, which was that Regulus had bought their safety with his own buried life, and that a debt like that is a terrible thing to lay on a child, even unspoken, even lovingly. Regulus did not move for a moment. Then he crossed the room, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not defend himself, because his son was right. That was the thing. The lad was completely right, and had seen to the bottom of it faster than Regulus ever had. You're right, Regulus said. Sit down. You're right, and I need you to hear me say it, so sit down. Harry sat. The chair was still overturned. He sat on the floor, and Regulus crouched to be level with him. The old trick from the shed and the byre, and Regulus crouched to be level with him. The old trick from the shed and the byre. Never loom. You don't owe me being small, Regulus said. You don't owe me anything. That's the first thing, and it's the most important, and I want you to carry it out of this room and never set it down. There is no debt. I didn't hide you to buy something. I hid you because you were mine to keep safe, and I kept you safe. And if I've ever once made you feel that you owed me for it, then I did it wrong and I'm sorry, and I'll spend the rest of my life doing it better. He let that sit, and you're right that it's mostly my danger. It is, and I've been standing here telling you all the reasons you can't go, and the true reason underneath them, the one I didn't say, is that I'm afraid. He did not flinch from the word. He'd made a rule, years ago, that he would not lie to them, and the rule held even here. I'm afraid of what happens to the three of us when the door opens, not to me, to this, to us. because it's been us on this beach for 10 years and it's the only good thing I've ever made. And the day you walk into that castle, it stops being just ours and becomes the world's, and I don't get you back the way I have you now. And I've been trying to keep it, and I dressed it up as keeping you, and that was a lie, and you caught it. You always catch it. Nobody said anything. Hermione had come around the table and was standing very close to Harry, one hand on his shoulder, the string between them drawn tight in the way it went tight only in the worst moments. So here's the truth, Regulus said. The whole of it, since we're doing the whole of it. You should go. Both of you. It's dangerous, and it's the end of the way we've lived, and you should go anyway because the alternative is that I love you into a cage, and I've been in a cage that someone builds out of love, out of what they called love, and I will cut my own hands off before I do it to you. You're going to Hogwarts. I decided it before the owls came, if you want the truth. I only wanted one more day of pretending I hadn't, and I've had it, and it's done. Now we stop arguing about whether, which was never the real question, and we start on how, which is the hard one, and which I'm going to need both of you clever heads for, because keeping you alive out there is going to take all three of us. Do we understand each other? Harry looked up at him, wet-faced, wrung out, 11 years old, and just told he was going to the castle after all. There's really a castle, he said. Small, and it was an apology and a surrender and a return all at once, Harry coming back from the ledge, and Regulus reached out and set the overturned chair on its feet, and put a hand on the back of the thundercloud head, once, briefly, which was as far as either of them ever went, and it was enough. It had always been enough. It had always been enough. There's really a castle, Regulus said. We light the lamps. You put them out, you can bring them back. Consider it your first lesson in cleaning up your own messes, of which you will make a great many, at a castle, starting in September. And Harry laughed thick and shaky, and lifted one hand, and the lamps came up one by one around the kitchen, and the argument was over, and the threshold was crossed, and none of them could go back across it now. He wrote to Dumbledore that night. It was the letter he had spent 12 years not writing, and he wrote it 4 times before he had it right. And even the right version was 3 lines long, because there was nothing to say that did not become, the moment he wrote it, either a confession or a plea. And Regulus Black would do a great many things, but he had not yet learned to plead. I have what you have been looking for. Both of what you have been looking for, the child, and the other thing, the one that hangs on a chain. I have kept them both safe for a decade, and I mean to go on keeping the first one safe forever. Meet me and I will explain the second one, which concerns you more than you know. Come alone. You will know the place. It is where my Uncle Alfred taught your order to trust exactly one black, once, a long time ago, and was right to. R.A.B. He did not expect it to work. Creature took it, grumbling, into a dawn that had not properly arrived. And Regulus sat up the rest of the night with a sick certainty that he had just ended everything, that Dumbledore would come with horrors, that he had traded 10 years of safety for a chance he could not afford. He did not sleep. He watched the tide go out and come in. And in the gray of the following evening, alone, without oars, on foot up the coast road like an ordinary traveler, came the oldest and most dangerous wizard in the world, in a plum-colored traveling cloak, pausing at the top of the hill to admire the sea. They met on the shingle, away from the house, away from the children, whom Regulus had sent up to Effie's on an invented errand. And the conversation that passed between them belongs mostly to the two of them and to the sharp register, and it is enough to say 3 things about it. The first is that Albus Dumbledore, who had believed for 10 years that Harry Potter was safe with his aunt and had built a great architecture of protective magic around that belief, listened to Regulus explain what he had done and why, and grew very old and very quiet, and said at last, I have been a fool about a great many things, and about that boy more than most. You did what I ought to have done and did not. I have no standing to reproach you, and I find I don't wish to. Which was not an apology from a man who did not much give them, but was near enough to one that Regulus set down a weight he'd been carrying since the night he took his son from the cupboard. The second is the locket. Regulus told him about the locket, and the cave, and the potion, and the splinter in Harry's scar, and Dumbledore listened to all of it with a stillness that had fear in it. Real fear. The first Regulus had ever seen the old man wear, and at the end Dumbledore said, You have been guarding a piece of his soul in your wall for 11 years and a second piece in your son's head, and you told no one, and you did not run mad. Regulus, I have known brave men. I am not sure I have known a braver thing than that. And they made, on the cold shingle, the beginning of a plan for the thing in the wall. Not that night, not soon, but a beginning. The first crack of daylight into a problem Regulus had faced alone for over a decade. And the third thing is Harry, and the school, and the terms. Dumbledore agreed to what Regulus asked, which was this. The children would come to Hogwarts under their own names because the castle would permit no other, but the story given to the world would be Dumbledore's to shape, and Dumbledore would shape it kindly. Harry Potter had been raised in secret for his protection, by a guardian who wished to remain private, and that guardian's name would not be spoken, and any who came sniffing after it would find Albus Dumbledore standing in the way, and there were not many in Britain who would push past Albus Dumbledore to get at a thing he had decided to keep. It was not perfect. Nothing was perfect. but it turned the impossible into the merely dangerous, and Regulus had spent his whole life in the merely dangerous and knew how to live there. They are remarkable, I take it, Dumbledore said at the top of the hill before he left. The children. They're ordinary, Regulus said, which was the highest praise he had and the truest thing he could have said, because he had spent 11 years making sure that 2 of the most hunted children in Britain got to be ordinary, muddy, argumentative, gap-toothed, ordinary children, and it was the whole of his life's work, and he would not have it called anything grander. They fight over stones. She corrects his grammar. He can't sit still. They're completely ordinary, and they're the best thing that ever happened, and I'd burn the world down before I let it make them into a story. Remember that, when you're shaping your kind version for the papers. Whatever you say about them, leave them room to be ordinary. It's the only thing I've ever really given them, and it's the only thing I'm asking you to protect. Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment, and something moved behind the half-moon spectacles that might have been sorrow and might have been hope and was probably in that old and complicated man, both at once. I will guard their ordinariness, he said, with everything I have. You have my word, Regulus Black. And for whatever it is worth from an old man who has made more mistakes than you have years, you have done a good thing here. A very good thing out of a very great deal of harm. I hope you know it. I'm learning to, Regulus said. And it was true. And it was the most he had ever admitted to anyone. And then the old man was gone down the far side of the hill into the dusk, and Regulus stood alone on the darkening coast with the whole shape of the future rearranged around him, and went in to relight the lamps before the children got back from Effie's. They went to London for the school things in the last week of August, and it was the first time in their lives that Harry and Hermione had left the North, and Regulus had not slept properly for a week beforehand from the sheer logistics of keeping them concealed in the one place in Britain where concealment was hardest, Diagon Alley in disguise. He'd thought about it for weeks. In the end, the disguise was the plainest kind and the best. They went as nobody. Harry's hair combed flat and parted, which lasted about 4 minutes, but bought the 4 minutes. A knitted cap over the scar, worn low, and a story ready about a birthmark if anyone asked, which no one did. Hermione in ordinary robes, indistinguishable from any of the 50 other Muggle-born children shopping for their first year, wide-eyed at everything, which was itself the perfect cover, because a Muggle-born gaping at Diagon Alley was the least remarkable sight in the wizarding world that week, and Regulus himself, this was the part he'd agonized over. Gray-haired, stooped, aged 20 years by a nondescript grandfather shepherding 2 nondescript children, unrecognizable even to the handful of people alive who might have known Regulus Black's 29-year-old face. He had not been in the wizarding world in 12 years. He had forgotten what it was. The noise of it hit him at the mouth of the alley like a wave. The crush and color and clamor of it, the shop fronts stacked to the sky, the owls and the cats and the cauldrons and the shouting, the sheer unhidden magical abundance of it. And he had a moment, one, where the beach and the quiet and the 10 years of gray seemed suddenly a impoverished thing to have given the children. And then he looked at their faces. He had never seen either of them look like that. Hermione had gone entirely silent, which, with Hermione, meant the very opposite of unmoved. It meant she had encountered more than she could speak, and she stood at the mouth of the alley with both hands pressed to her mouth and her eyes going everywhere at once, drinking it, cataloging it, home before she'd taken a step into it, this world she'd been told all her life she belonged to and had never once seen. And Harry had taken his hat half off in his wonder, and Regulus had to reach over and tug it back down, and the lad didn't even notice. Because Harry was looking up at a world with a castle at the end of it, and he was grinning the grin he grinned on the broom. The one that meant he had found a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. Right, Regulus said, in the borrowed old voice gruffer than his own. We do this in order, and we do it quick, and we don't dawdle, and I know you both want to dawdle, and we're not going to. Robes first. Then books. And yes, Hermione, all the books. I've seen the list and I've seen your face, and we'll get the whole list and not 1 volume more. Don't think I don't know that shop has a back room. Then the boring bits, cauldron and scales and a telescope you'll use twice. And last, he paused, because even in disguise, even gruff, he could not quite keep the thing out of his voice. Last, the wand. We save the wand for last. A wand's not a purchase, it's an introduction. You don't rush an introduction. Ollivander's was narrow and dim and smelled of dust and secrets, and the old man behind the counter looked at the 2 children with pale eyes that saw a great deal more than Regulus was comfortable with. And Regulus stood by the door in his borrowed age and kept very still and hoped. Hermione went first because Harry insisted, shoving her forward, a generosity that cost him because he was desperate for his own turn. But he wanted to watch her have hers, wanted her to go into the real world of it first and find that it fit her. And Regulus saw the gesture for what it was and said nothing, and loved Harry the more for it. Ollivander measured her with a floating tape and pulled boxes and put wands in her hand and took them away again, and Hermione tried each one with the fierce concentration she brought to everything, and each one did nothing, or worse than nothing. One shattered a vase, one filled the shop with the smell of burnt toast, and Regulus watched the doubt creep back into her, the old doubt. Maybe it's a mistake, maybe I don't fit here after all. And he could not cross the shop to reach it without breaking his disguise, and he stood by the door helpless while his daughter's certainty leaked away box. And then Ollivander stopped and looked at her differently and went into the back and came out with a box that had dust on it, older than the others, and he opened it and said, "Vinewood, Dragon Heartstring, 10 3/4 inches. I have had this one a long time. It is particular. It has been waiting, I think, for someone particular." And he put it into Hermione's hand, and the shop went still, and Hermione, who came from nowhere, who was a spring and not a river, who had been told her whole young life in 100 small ways that she was let in on sufferance, Hermione raised the Vinewood wand, and it lit, warm and gold and certain, the light of it filling the dim shop and filling her face, and the doubt did not creep back this time, because you cannot doubt a thing your own hand has just proven, and Regulus watched his daughter find out, past all argument, that she belonged, and he had to look at the floor for a moment, in his borrowed age, by the door. Harry's wand found him faster and stranger. Ollivander took one look at the child, at the shape of him, at the cap Regulus prayed he would not ask to remove, and went unerringly to a particular shelf, and pulled a particular box, and his pale eyes had gone sharp and strange, and he said, "Curious." Curious, in a way Regulus did not care for at all, and put into Harry's hand the wand of holly and phoenix feather, 11 inches, and it lit for Harry the instant he touched it, red and gold and immediate, no searching, no doubt, the wand and his son recognizing each other across the counter like old friends meeting again. "Curious," Ollivander said a third time, very softly, looking at Harry, at the cap, at the place under the cap. "I remember every wand I have ever sold, young man. Every one, and the phoenix, whose tail feather is in your wand, gave one other feather. Only one other. It is very curious that you should be destined for this wand when its brother." "We'll take it," said Regulus from the door in the gruff borrowed voice, louder than he'd meant. "The both of them. What's owed?" And Ollivander looked across the shop at the gray-stooped grandfather by the door, and his pale eyes narrowed. And for one long, terrible moment, Regulus was certain the old man saw straight through the charm to whatever was underneath, and knew, and would say. But Ollivander was a keeper of secrets by trade, and had kept the secrets of every wand buyer in Britain for a century. And whatever he saw, he folded away behind his pale eyes and did not speak, and named a price and wrapped the wands, and only at the very door, as they left, said quietly, to Regulus alone, "Whoever you are, sir, you have raised them well. The wands don't lie about that. A wand chooses warm or it chooses cold, depending on the hand it's been shaped by. Those two chose very warm indeed." And he inclined his head and let them go, and kept the secret. Because the world is full, here and there, of people who choose to keep the right secrets, and Regulus had spent his life being saved by them, without ever learning to expect it. The danger they'd braced for all day brushed past them in the bookshop of all places, and it was so quiet that only Regulus knew it had happened at all. They were in Flourish and Blots, where Hermione had gone still and reverent the way she went in the presence of more books than she could count, and Regulus was steering her firmly past the back room, the way he'd warned her he would, and a man came in, an ordinary-looking man, well-dressed, with a walking stick and a drawl, and Regulus knew him, knew the face under 15 years of aging, knew the family, one of the ones that had bought its way out of Azkaban after the war with gold and a story about enchantment. And Regulus turned his gray disguised head away and became very interested in a shelf of second-hand potions texts, and put his body, without seeming to, between the man and the two children. The man did not notice them. That was the whole of it. That was the entire brush with disaster. The man swept through the shop on some errand of his own, radiating the cold entitlement of his kind, and paused once near Harry, and looked down at the lad in the knitted cap browsing the Quidditch shelf, and something flickered over the man's face. Not recognition. Nothing so sharp, just the faint, instinctive distaste of a certain sort of person, for a child who was plainly not important. And he moved on, and never knew that he had stood 18 inches rife. He had hent wide-eighth. Regulus stood very still by the potion shelf until the shop door had closed. Then he collected the children and paid for the books, all of Hermione's list and not one volume more, and walked them out into the alley. And only when they were 3 streets away and safe did he let out the breath he'd been holding and understood, again, the thing he'd learned over the ruined haircut years before, that the best concealment was not the shadow, but the plain, bright, ordinary day. That a hunted child in a knitted cap, browsing a Quidditch shelf, was invisible precisely, was he was ordinary. That Raxkulitz at the Radadsk. It was the whole of his life strategy vindicated in a bookshop in 18 inches of terrible proximity, and it had held, and the children never knew, and he did not tell them, because there are frights a parent carries alone, so that the children can go on believing the day was only a good one. The last night at the cottage nobody slept much, and everybody pretended to. The trunks stood packed by the door, 2 of them, with the cabin cases and the owl cage. They'd bought an owl in the end, a small brown thing Harry named Tam after the fisherman, over Hermione's objection that you couldn't name an owl after a person. And Harry's counter that you could name an owl whatever you liked, and that was the whole point of owls. The school robes hung ready. The wands were on the mantel where both children could see them from their beds, because neither could stand to have the wand out of sight yet. the newness of it still too bright. Regulus went around the house doing the small, pointless tasks a person does on the last night of a thing, and found himself, near midnight, standing in the doorway of the small room where the two of them lay not sleeping. And he had not meant to make a speech, and did not make one, but he sat down on the floor between the two beds, the way he had 1,000 nights, because it was the last time he would be able to, at least in this shape, with them this small, and he wanted the 1,001st. "You'll be sorted into houses," he said, into the dark, quietly, picking up a conversation they'd been circling for weeks. "You'll want to know which. Everyone does. And I'll tell you the thing my mother never told me, which is that it doesn't matter half so much as the school pretends. A house is a place to sleep and a set of people to start with. It's not a sentence. I was a Slytherin. So was every rotten thing my family ever produced, and so was my Uncle Alfred, who was the best man I ever knew, and both of those were true at once and the house didn't decide it. You'll go where you go. If they're separated, you two," he stopped, because this was the fear under all the fears, for both children, that the string between them would be cut by a hat. If the hat puts you in different houses, it changes nothing that matters. Do you hear me? Nothing. You'll still be at the same castle. You'll still find each other at every meal. The hat sorts where you sleep. It does not sort who you are to each other. Nobody sorts that. You did that yourselves years ago on this beach, and there's no hat old enough to undo it. A science. Then Hermione, small, "What if I'm not brave enough for Gryffindor and not clever enough for Ravenclaw and not, what if the hat can't find anywhere to put me?" "You are the cleverest person I have ever met," Regulus said, "including everyone I met before you, and I met some clever and terrible people, and you're cleverer than all of them, and you're kinder than all of them, and you're kinder than all of them. And if that hat sits on your head and can't find somewhere to put you, then the hat is broken, and I'll write a very sharp letter. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen is the hat's going to have too many places it wants to put you. And it's going to have to choose, and whichever it chooses, it'll be choosing among your virtues, not your lacks. Now that was the last worry I'm answering tonight. Go to sleep. You were trained to be humiliated by in the morning if you're too tired to run at the wall properly." "The wall," Harry said, delighted and appalled. The wall having become his single favorite fact about the entire wizarding world. "We have to run at a wall." "You have to run at a wall," Regulus confirmed. "It's the first test. The school starts weeding out the timid before you've even boarded. Go to sleep." He did not go to sleep himself. He sat on the floor between their beds until their breathing went long and even and true, and then he sat a while longer, in the dark, in the small room where he had nursed a fever and answered 10,000 questions, and mended a crooked dog, and he let himself, for once, feel the whole size of what tomorrow was, which was that he was giving them to the world he had hidden them from for their entire lives, and that the giving was right and necessary, and the correct and loving thing, and that it would take it Peter base. That had always been the job. You raise them toward a door and then you open it, even though opening it is the last thing your arms want to do, because the alternative is a cage, and he had promised, on the shingle, to cut his own hands off first. Creature found him there near dawn and did not comment, and put a blanket over the two sleeping children, and stood beside Regulus a while in the gray light. "Creature is going too," the elf said. At last, it was not a question. "To the school. Creature will not be seen, but Creature will be there, in the walls, watching the young." He still, after 10 years, could not quite land the word, and it still, after 10 years, came out as something more tender for the fumbling, watching them. "Creature has already decided. Master will not argue." "No," Regulus agreed. "Master will not argue." And he was glad of it, glad past speaking, because it meant that when he could not be there, and he could not be there, that was the whole cruelty of it. He could not walk them to the castle, or watch them at their meals, or be down the hall when the thunder came, when he could not be there. Something that loved them would be in the walls, unseen, keeping the perimeter he could no longer keep himself. "Thank you, Creature," he said, which he did not say often, and the old elf's face did a complicated thing and he stumped off to make a breakfast nobody would be able to eat. King's Cross was vast and loud and full of muggles, and the barrier between platforms 9 and 10 looked, to two children from an empty coast, like a perfectly ordinary and perfectly terrifying stretch of brick. Regulus was still in his borrowed age, gray and stooped, a grandfather seeing his grandchildren off, and it was the cruelest part of the whole cruel day because he could not be himself for it. He could not stand on the platform as Regulus. He had to hang back at the edges, an old stranger with a luggage trolley, and he had rehearsed this, had told himself it did not matter, that the children knew who he was under the gray hair, and that was what counted, and it did not help at all, because he wanted, on this day of all days, to be seen by them as himself, and he could not be, and it was the price of the whole long-hidden decade come due all once on a railway platform. They went through the barrier one at a time. Hermione first, at a dead determined run, her face set, and she vanished into the brick and was gone, and Harry after her, and Regulus last with the trolley. And then they were through, and the Scar's engine stood steaming in front of them under a wrought iron arch, and the platform was a river of trunks and owls and weeping mothers and shouting children, and the two of them stopped dead and stared at it, and Regulus stood behind them in his gray disguise and watched them look at the beginning of their lives. There was not much time. There was never enough time. The train would go at 11, and it was 10 too. And around them families were doing the loud business of farewell, and Regulus drew the two children a little aside, into the lee of a pillar, out of the crush, for the goodbye he'd been dreading for weeks. He crouched down, old habit, never loom, and it let him be level with them one last time before the year took them. Now, he said, low, in his own voice, which he let come back for just this, just the three of them behind the pillar, the charm holding his face gray, but the voice underneath it his. You'll write. Both of you every week, and more if anything's wrong. And I mean anything, I don't care how small. You write it and Tam brings it and I'll have it that night. If either of you is in trouble, real trouble, the sharp kind, the kind we don't joke about, you tell Dumbledore and you say to him only, the man from the beach needs to know and he'll get word to me before morning. That's the whole of the emergency. You don't have to be brave about it. You don't have to handle it yourselves. You have a home. And it has a door, and the door is always, always open. And if the world out there gets to be too much, you come home and no one will ever call it failing. Do you understand me? There is no version of coming home that is failing. That door does not know the word. Hermione was nodding, fast, her mouth pressed tight, holding herself together, rigid and furious, and 11. Harry had gone very still. And the other thing, Regulus said, and here his voice went to the register he almost never used with them, the plainest one, under even the sharp register, the one with nothing guarded in it at all. You have each other. That's the thing I need you to hold on to over everything else I've said. Whatever house you're in, whatever the year does to you, however far apart they put your beds, you two look after each other. You've been doing it since before you could talk. She'll steady you when the thunder comes. He looked at Harry, and you'll thaw her when she's frozen herself solid over something that isn't worth it. He looked at Hermione. You're each other's home when you're too far from this one. You always have been. I only ever built a house around a thing the two of you already were. Don't let the castle make you forget it. Everything else out there is weather. That, he looked from one to the other, that's the coast. That holds. The whistle blew, the 2-minute whistle, and around them the farewells went up a pitch. And there was no more time. There was never any more time. Hermione broke first. She threw her arms around him, hard, fierce, furious, and pressed her face into the shoulder of his gray disguise and said something into it that he couldn't hear and didn't need to, and he held her, this girl he'd found in a shed in the snow, the spring that had risen up out of nothing. And he said into her hair, too quiet for anyone but her, you belong there. You belong everywhere. Go and prove it to them and write and tell me how badly they took it. And she laughed, wet and cracked into his shoulder, and let go because Hermione always let go before it broke her. That was her armor, and he would not take it from her. Harry did not throck Drombarabab, and since his men of feet. So Andy disliking not by the marrying at Roldian at a train, and Regulus understood it at once, at an aboyne at once, wanting, and a rye was giving him that didn't it once. And Sidru poyed bravely for him. The way Hermione had been being brave for Harry over the thunder, and sword friend, and so Regulus said, my cotty court heb but cried was slake. Before you're married, Harry said, muffled into the grey shoulder. The old promise. The rule against death, laid down on a cliff road at 7, called in now on a railway platform at 11. You said, you have to be there. That's still a rule. It's still a rule, Regulus said. Get on the train. They got on the train. They found a window and pressed their faces to it, and the great engine gathered itself and heaved and began to move, and Regulus stood on the platform in his borrowed age among the other left-behind grown-ups, one gray-stooped stranger in a crowd of them, and he raised one hand, not too high, not enough to be noticed by anyone but the two children hanging out the window of a scarlet train, and they saw it, and that they waved bapt, and then they bade out home. He stood a while after, longer than the other parents. The steam thinned and cleared and the platform emptied, and still he stood, an old man by a pillar, and no one paid him any mind, which was the whole point of the disguise and the whole grief of it. Then he picked up the empty trolley and walked back through the barrier into the muggle world and let the gray charm fall the moment he was through it, and was himself again, 29 and young and thinned at the center, in a crowd that had no idea what had just happened to him. And he found that he could breathe after all, and that the coast was still there under everything, holding exactly as he'd told them it would. The first letter came the next night, as promised. Small brown Tam arriving out of the dark and landing on the table with the air of an owl who has flown a very long way to deliver something momentous and knows it. There were 2 letters in one, written on the same sheet, top and bottom. The 2 hands he knew better than his own. Hermione's small and level and racing. Harry's a scrawl that fell downhill across the page. Hermione's half was orderly and 3 times too long, and Regulus read every word twice. Gryffindor, she wrote, underlined, and then in a rush that undid all her usual order, the hat took ages with me. It said Ravenclaw would suit, but that I'd be wasted where I was only clever. It said the thing I wanted most was to be brave enough to match how clever I already was, and that Gryffindor was where I'd have the chance. And Regitant. Regulus, reading it, thought, because you told it. Without was his cant, and what mowit, and Harry's half, downhill, blotted Gr. Rifimdor. Same as Hermione. The hat barely touched me, it just shouted it. There's a boy called Ron whose whole family is Gryffindor. He's got hand-me-down everything and he doesn't care and has brilliant. The ceiling is the sky, Reg. It just is the sky. Hermione already corrected a prefect. I flew today. They put us on school brooms. Mine was rubbish compared to Alfred's, but I still. The teacher saw and she said things I'm not going to write down because Hermione says it's bragging. The wall was easy. You were right to make it a big deal so I'd be scared. That was mean. I forgive you. And then, at the very bottom, in the small space left, the 2 hands together, a line each, the way they signed the important ones. Say Mecken Makablich, that Mediting, that many, Tenbertav Kendevelturzid, Innai by Vand. Somewhere on a train or under a hat, and Regulus sat at the kitchen table in the empty cottage with the letter in his hand, and Creature pretending not to watch from the hearth. The string held a socked. The string held. And he set the letter down flat and pressed it flat with both palms the way Hermione had pressed her accepted, flat. A white what en belag cut of decometer please. So chits at both knitted and had his fog. Chapter 4. What the winter took. Effie Ross died in the first week of the Christmas holidays, and the bell in Sorn told her out across the frozen hills, and the 2 children who had learned to walk in her byre were home from school to hear it. They were 15 now. That was the strange thing about the years since the letters came. They went in a scatter of terms and holidays, the cottage full and loud for 6 weeks and then silent for 3 months, so the Regulus measured the children's growing the way you measure a coastline's change, not in the daily wearing, but in the shock of the return. Each September, they left as one thing, and each December they came back another, taller, stranger, their voices altered, their concerns rearranged, and Regulus had learned to greet the strangers they'd become without flinching, and to find, underneath the strangers, the 2 people he knew, who were always still there, only further in. Harry at 15 had grown into his hands and most of the way into his temper. He was lean and quick and reckless in a manner that Regulus recognized to the marrow. Because it was serious, it was the black recklessness surfacing in the one black, who wasn't one by blood. The leap before you look that Regulus had spent his own boyhood being the careful, terrified opposite of. Harry played Quidditch for his house and flew like his life depended on it, and it frightened Regulus every time the lad mentioned it casually in a letter. Some catch made 40 feet up at a speed no sane person would choose. He led with his heart still. That hadn't changed and never would. But the heart was bigger now and led further and further from home. And Regulus watched it go with the particular helpless pride of a man who has raised a brave child and must now live with the bravery. Hermione at 15 had become, more or less, the woman she would be. She was formidable in a way that had stopped being funny and started being simply true. She was top of her year in everything and second to nothing, and she had already, at 15, made enemies of the comfortable and the cruel by the simple method of being right at them, out loud, in public, without apology. She had causes now. She wrote to Regulus about the treatment of house elves, not knowing, or perhaps knowing exactly, that Creature read every letter over his shoulder and had opinions, and about the unfairness of the old blood laws, and about a dozen injustices she had noticed the way she'd once noticed a torn page as things she could not abide and therefore intended to mend. Fix it, the whole of her had become. The whole of her had become that old joke made into a life. And the 2 of them together, at 15, had begun to be careful with each other in a way that was new, and that Regulus watched with a wariness he kept off his face. The old easy tangle of their childhood, the 2 heads on the one pillow, had complicated. There was a distance in it now that was not coldness, but its opposite, the distance of 2 people who have become aware of each other as separate and are managing it, and don't yet have the words. Hermione had taken to going still when Harry came into a room. Harry had taken to knowing, without looking, exactly where in a room Hermione was. Neither of them had said anything to the other, and certainly not to Regulus, and Regulus said nothing either because they were 15 and it was theirs, and it was the one part of their growing he had no business in and wanted none. They stood together at Effie Ross's graveside in the iron December cold, the 3 of them and half the village, and the bell tolled, and the frozen ground had been broken with picks for the coffin because you could not dig it soft that week. And Harry, who had wept at Tam's grave at 7 and stood straight and silent, stood straight and silent and stood straight and silent again. Now, older, the same fishhook still on its string under his collar, and Hermione held Regulus's hand the way she had at 7, and did not ask any questions, and it meant now what it had meant then. Afterward, at the tea, an old woman none of them knew pressed something into Regulus's hand. Effie left it, she said. Said give it the young man with the 2 bairns when I was gone, not before. Said he'd know what it meant, and I wasn't to ask. And she went away, and Regulus opened his hand, and it was a key. An ordinary iron key to the byre gate, the gate he had mended with a flick of his wand 8 summers before while the old Muggle woman watched and said only handy. She had known what he was for 8 years and never once said so, and she had left him the key to her gate, which was her whole plain, flinty way of saying the thing she'd never said, which was, "You belong here too. You and yours. This was your place as much as anyone's. Come back and let the goats out when I'm gone." Regulus closed his hand around the key and put it in his pocket and did not let his face do anything and kept the goats, in the end, for years, because you did not refuse a gift like that from a woman like that. The crooked dog was still on the mantel. That was the thing Harry always checked, first thing, every homecoming. Before he'd even set his trunk down, he glanced at the mantel to see that dog was still there, one-legged, mended in matchwood and glue 14 years before, standing crooked exactly as it had always stood. And Regulus had learned that the glance was not childishness, but its opposite, a 15-year-old confirming that the fixed point still held, that however much the terms changed him each September, the house had not moved. It never had. That was its whole job. Dog stood crooked on the mantel, and the blue blanket, threadbare now to gauze, still lived folded on the settle, and the brown paper notebook Hermione had mapped the house in at 8 was still in the drawer where she'd left it, and every holiday she took it out once and looked at the shaded space with its pencil question mark. The room she promised not to measure again. And put it back, keeping the 8-year-old's word with a 15-year-old's hands. They'd built the harbor again that last summer too. Bigger, as Hermione had promised at 8, every summer bigger. The low stone arm reaching further into the pool each year and every winter storm taking most of it back, and neither of them had ever once suggested stopping, because the harbor was not for lasting. She'd settled that philosophy at 8 and never revised it. The harbor was for building again. It was the most Hermione thing in the world, and Harry had spent 14 summers hauling stones for it without ever quite understanding why and loving it anyway. And standing on the frozen shingle the day after Effie's funeral, looking at the winter wreck of the summer's work, Harry had said, "We'll build it again." Not a question. And Hermione had said, "Bigger," and that had been the whole of their grief for Effie spoken aloud, in the private shorthand of two people who had been each other's country since before they could talk. Hermione found out he was dying on the 3rd day of the holidays, and she found it out the way she found out everything, by refusing to stop looking. He had been careful. He thought he had been careful. But he was not well, and he had not been well for a long time, and the not being well had crossed some line that winter from a thing he could hide to a thing that hid him. The thinness at his center, the years he'd spent on Harry's fever 14 winters before, had never come back, and the cave poison that creature's magic had never fully cleaned from him was doing, slowly, over a decade and a half, the work it had been made to do fast. He tired in the afternoons now and could not always hide it. His hands were unreliable in the cold. And once, that first week, Hermione came into the kitchen without warning and found him sitting very still at the table with his eyes shut and one hand flat against his chest. And he opened his eyes and rearranged his face, and it was too late, because Hermione did not miss things and had not missed this. She did not confront him at once. That was the frightening part. How she went about it. She watched. For 2 days she watched him with the same relentless attention she'd once turned on the missing room in the house, and she measured, she was always measuring. The afternoons he disappeared to lie down, the meals he moved around his plate, the stairs he took slower than a 29-year, no, he was 34 now, but a 34-year-old should not take stairs like that. And on the 3rd night, when Harry had gone up, she sat down across the table from Regulus and put both hands flat on the wood and looked at him with her mother's, no, with her own, entirely her own, with her own terrible level gaze, and said, "You promised you'd tell me about the room when I was older. I'm older. I'm calling it in. All of it. The room, and the thing in it, and whatever's wrong with you, because it's the same story, isn't it? It's all one story, and you've been carrying it alone for 15 years, and it's killing you, and I want it, now. Tonight. You promised, and you've never once broken a promise to me, and I'm not going to let this be the first one." Regulus looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. She was 15, and she was right, and she had earned it years ago and waited, kept her word about the notebook in the passage, and never measured the room again. All these years, on the strength of a promise he'd made her at 8. He owed her. He had always known the debt would come due, and he had, if he was honest, hoped to be gone before it did, so that she would never have to carry the weight of the true story. But she was too clever to be spared and too brave to be lied to. And she was sitting across the table with her hands flat on the wood, waiting, and he had made a rule long ago that he would not lie to them, so he told her. He told her all of it, the cave and the locket and the potion he had drunk, meaning to die, the dead in the black water, creature's magic tearing him loose, the year he'd spent believing his survival a mistake, the night he'd read of Harry's parents in a salt-stained paper and gone to look at a house and found a heavy man mowing grass and a boy already put in a cupboard and said no, the shed in the snow where he'd found her, and her rabbit, and her name on a scorched envelope. The splinter of the Dark Lord's soul in Harry's scar, and the night of the fever and what he'd spent to quiet it, the years of his own life poured out through runes on a cold floor. And the thing in the wall, the locket, the piece of that same soul he had guarded for 15 years because he had never found a way to end it, and which was, Dumbledore believed, connected to the slow poison in him, feeding on him a little across all these years. The way it fed on everything near it, so that Regulus had been dying by inches to keep it caged, and had let it because caging it kept them safe. Hermione listened to all of it without moving. She did not cry. She had learned that from him, he supposed, the not crying, and he was sorry for it and proud of it at once. She listened as she did everything, completely, and when he was done, she was silent a long moment, and then she said the thing he should have known she'd say because it was the only thing a person like her could say. Then we destroy it. The locket, we find how, and we destroy it, and you stop dying to hold it. That's the answer. That's the only answer. You've been trying to solve it alone for 15 years, and you're one man with an old education, and you told me that yourself. And now there are 3 of us, and one of us is me, and I don't lose. Reg, I don't lose. Show me the room. Hermione, show me the room. Her voice did not rise. It went instead very quiet and very hard. The sharp register, his own register, turned back on him by a girl who'd learned it at his knee. You made me a promise. Keep the whole of it or none of it. Show me the room. He showed her the room. He did not show her the locket that night. He showed her the sealed door and the wards, and enough of the shape of the problem to satisfy the promise. And then he shut it again because it was late and she was 15, and the thing behind the stone had felt her the moment she came near it and had begun, in its private language, to reach for the newest and most interesting mind in the house. And Regulus would not have that, not at any price. But something had changed and could not be changed back. The story was out. The weight was shared. And Hermione, who had carried lighter things her whole life by the simple method of refusing to put them down, took up the heaviest thing in the house as though it were hers by right, which, he supposed, having been raised by him, it was. And if you make me keep a secret this size from him, you'll break the one thing that's held the 2 of us together our whole lives, which is that we don't lie to each other wither. When she would they 14, what with? He took the broom off its pegs, Alfred's broom, the silver gray one that had known him at 7, and he went out into the black December afternoon in a temper that had nowhere to go, and he flew. He flew out over the winter sea in the failing light, too fast, too far, in weather that no sane flyer would go up in, and Regulus stood at the window and watched the small, furious shape of his sun fling itself around the sky above the freezing water, and understood exactly what it was, because he had a brother who had done the same thing at the same age, with the same grief, gone up into the sky to be angry where the ground couldn't hold him. And Regulus had spent his own boyhood on the ground, watching Sirius do it, and never once understood it, and tetnade disfleewit and narabalik. Indian, I did the jerkin one sure chifferate. He did not call Harry in. You could not call that in. He'd learned it years ago in a storm, that the fear that would not yield to a guardian sometimes had to be spent in the sky, or in a sister's arms, or in the sea, in some element bigger than the fear. He let Harry fly, and when the child finally came down, frozen and wind-scoured and empty, Regulus was waiting on the shingle with a blanket. The way he'd waited on the shingle 14 years before with a cold cup of tea, and Harry landed and stood there shaking, wrung out, and said, in a voice that had gone hoarse from shouting at the sea, "You should have told us. Years ago. You should have. We could have been helping. All this time you were and we were at school being stupid about houses and Quidditch, and you were here dying, and you let us not know, so we wouldn't be sad." And that's, he ran out of words, as he always did, and finished with the true one, the childish one, the only one big enough that's not fair, Reg. No, Regulus said. He put the blanket around his son's shoulders. It isn't. Almost nothing important is. Come inside, you'll freeze, and then I'll have died for nothing, which would be a poor joke. And Harry made a sound that was half a laugh and half the other thing, and let himself be walked up the shingle, and that was the beginning of the family closing ranks around the thing in the wall, the 3 of them and Creature. The War Council convened at last after 15 years of Regulus fighting alone. There was a night that week, in the thick of the new grief, that belonged to Harry and Hermione, and Regulus saw only the edge of it, and knew better than to see more. He had come down for water near 1 in the morning and found them in the front room, the 2 of them sitting on the floor with their backs against the settle, and the fire burned down to coals, not touching, a careful hand's width of dark air between them, talking low. He stopped in the passage where they couldn't see him. He should have gone back up. He stayed a moment. 1, because a man who is dying gets to be selfish about a moment now and then, and because the thing he saw was the thing he built his whole ruined life to make, and he wanted to look at it once more before the year took them back. I did that and it arrived. It's getting out in second of the squink when not now why it hot. It's not in here. Our tide ready the somehow fight where have beated some whites and Hult can make it big into bigger like I think I can have under the figure of the You don't have to fix it, Harry said after a while. His voice had gone rough. That's not Hermione. Not everything's a thing you fix. Some things you stand in front of them, like his mom and dad did. Like he did in the cave. You can't fix that, the man's going to die. Nobody can. You get in front of it with him. You be there for the small number of days, and you make them not small. You make each one." He ran out and finished plainly. "We've got him now. He's downstairs now. Let's just be here now. That's all any of us gets. He taught us that. Everything else is weather." And Hermione turned her face into her brother's shoulder, into Harry's shoulder, the lad she'd shared a pillow with at 3 and a sorting with at 11, and something more complicated than either at 15. And she let herself, for once, for him, in the dark where only he would ever know it, stop being the one who didn't lose, and Harry held her while she came apart and put herself back together, and said nothing more. And Regulus went back up the stairs without his water and tell Nate not, now me tell. They would find their way to the other thing in their own time, those two. He'd known for a year it was coming, the way you know the tide. But this was the ground it would grow from. This exact thing he'd watched in the coal light. Not the flutter and the blush the world made such noise about. But this, a boy closing a hand's width of dark air to hold his frightened sister who was not his sister, while she grieved the only father either of them had known. Whatever they became to each other, it would be built on this, and a thing built on this would hold. And Regulus climbed the stairs a little less afraid of leaving them, because he had just seen the foundation, and it was sound. Sirius came a week later, and he came in the night, and he came as a dog. Regulus knew the dog. That was the thing that undid him, standing in the doorway at 2 in the morning with his wand up, looking at the great, black, filthy, half-starved dog on his doorstep in the snow. He knew it. He'd known it since they were boys, the shape his brother took, the secret Sirius and James and the others had kept, that Regulus had discovered at 14 and never told, one of the few loyal things he'd done in a disloyal boyhood. He knew the dog, and the dog knew him and stood in the snow looking up at the brother it had believed dead for 16 years, and then it changed the way they did, unfolding up out of itself into a man. And the man was Sirius Black, gaunt and gray and hunted and free, staring at Regulus in the doorway with an expression that had traveled a very long way past shock. "You're dead," Sirius said. His voice had gone strange from years of disuse into mentors. "Reg, you've been dead 16 years. I mourned you. I mourned you in Azkaban. He stopped. He was looking past Regulus now, into the house, at the small figure that had appeared at the top of the stairs, woken by voices, a lean, dark-haired boy of 15, with a scar on his forehead, and James Potter's exact shape, and Lily Potter's exact eyes, standing frozen on the stairs looking down at a stranger in the doorway, and Sirius made a sound Regulus had never heard a person make, and said, "Harry," in a voice that broke clean in half on the single word. "Harry! Oh God, Harry, you had him. All this time. You had him, you dead man, you took him and you had him and you never." It could have gone 100 ways, and most of them badly. 2 black brothers, one back from a false death and one back from a true prison. 16 years of silence and grief and a war between them, and a boy on the stairs who was the living knot of all of it. James's son, Sirius's godson, Regulus's whole heart. It could have ended in curses on the doorstep. It nearly did. There was a moment, early, when Sirius's grief turned to fury, and the fury needed a target, and Regulus was the only one standing there. The brother who'd taken the things Sirius should have had, who'd raised Harry. Sirius had rotted in Azkaban, unable to reach, and Sirius's hand went for a wand he no longer had, an old reflex, and Regulus did not raise his own, just stood there and let his brother see that he wouldn't, and something in that stillness stopped it, and then Harry came down the stairs. He came down slowly, and he stopped 3 steps up so that he was level with the 2 grown men, and he lifted the gaunt hunted stranger who had spoken his name like a wound, and Harry, who felt things in his body before he found words, who led with his heart always. Harry said, "You're Sirius. You're Reg told me about you. Years ago. He said you were his brother and you were in Azkaban for something you didn't do." He said it flatly, the sharp register, Regulus's register, and both grown men went still. "He said you were innocent. He said it was a man named Pettigrew, and everyone got it wrong and there was nothing he could do about it without giving all of us away, and it was the one thing in his whole life he was most ashamed he couldn't fix. He told me that when I was 13, he cried. I'd never seen him cry. He cried about you." Harry looked at Regulus and then back at Sirius. "So, you're my godfather, and you're his brother, and you're both idiots, apparently, which Hermione says runs in families." A pause. There's food. Creature will pretend he's not glad to feed you, but he will. "Come in out of the snow. Both of you. It's freezing and I'm not doing this on the stairs." And that was Harry. At 15, that was the whole of Harry, the child who could stand in the wreck of 16 years of family grief and cut straight through it to the 2 things that mattered. Come in out of the snow and I'm not doing this on the stairs. And I'm not doing this on the stairs. And it broke the moment open. And Sirius came in, and Creature fed him pretending not to be glad, and the 2 brothers sat at the kitchen table where Regulus had told his daughter he was dying, and began, slowly, terribly, Arcath. Into the sick. What passed between the brothers that night and the nights after belongs to them, and to the sharp register. And it is enough to say that it did not heal in a night, because things that break over 16 years do not, but that it began. Sirius learned that his brother had turned against the Dark Lord before the end. had gone into a cave to strike a blow at him alone, had meant to die doing it, and instead had lived to raise the son of the man Sirius had loved best. And Regulus learned that his brother had not been the careless golden traitor Regulus had spent his boyhood resenting, but a man who had lost everyone in a single night and been buried alive for it, and had held on to his mind in that stone hole for 12 years on the strength of one fact, which was that he was innocent, and one hope, which was that he was innocent, and one hope, which was that he might someday get out and find James's son and do the one thing left to him, which was to be, at last, the godfather he'd sworn to be. And instead, he found a son already raised, already loved, already whole, raised by the brother he'd written off, in a warm, crooked house on a cold coast with a sister who wasn't his sister, and an elf who wasn't his servant, and a guardian who was dying to keep him safe. Sirius had come north with 16 years of stored-up fathering and found the position filled, and that was its own grief, and Regulus watched his brother sit in it and did the hardest, generous thing of his life, which was to make room. There was Arage, there was a Celeber, there was a one of them, who turned it. Sirius had been sitting up alone in the dark kitchen, unable to sleep, the way the released prisoners never could, and Regulus had come down and found him there, and the two of them had fallen into the old family register without meaning to, the cold-cutting one, the one their mother had taught them, and within 3 sentences they were boys again, saying the cruel practice things, Sirius calling Regulus their mother's creature, and Regulus calling Sirius, the family's coward in flight, both of them, shape, and it would have gone somewhere neither could come back from, except the creature had appeared in the doorway in the dark, woken by the raised voices, and had sat down in front of each brother, without a word, a cup of the same cocoa he had made them both as small boys in the old dark house, in the same chipped nursery cups he had somehow carried through 50 years in 2 households, and had stumped off again, and the 2 grown men had looked at the ridiculous childhood cups steaming in front of them and at each other. And the old cruel register had simply collapsed because you cannot go on being mother's weapons at each Kobold for elf. Sirius had laughed first, a cracked, terrible, helpless laugh, and Regulus had followed, and the fight had drained out of the night, and they had drunk the cocoa. 2 black brothers in their 30s in a dark kitchen with a war and a prison, and 16 years between them, drinking the exact drink of their ruined shared boyhood, and it had done what nothing said could have. Creature who had loved exactly one person for 50 years and now loved a whole crowded houseful, had understood something the clever brothers had missed, which was that the way back to each other did not run through the grievances at all. It ran through the 2 small cold boys they'd both been, who had had no one but each other, and an elf, in a house that gave them cocoa and nothing warmer, and who had loved each other once before the world got between them, in the only country where that love was still simple, which was the past, which Creature had just poured them a cup of. He needs you, Regulus told Sirius on the 3rd night, out on the shingle where the important things got said. Not instead of me. There's no instead. You don't replace people. I told them that years ago, and it's true. But he needs a Sirius. He's got my careful in him from being raised by me, and he's got your reckless in him from I don't know where, from the blood he doesn't share with either of us, from James, from the sheer bloody-mindedness of the universe. And the reckless is going to get him killed if there's no one who understands it. And I don't. I never did. I spent my whole life being frightened of exactly the thing he's made of. You're the one who understands it. You went up over that sea in a temper at his age, same as he did last week. I watched you do it 50 times and never understood it once. He needs someone who's been up there. That's you. It was always going to have to be you. He looked at his brother in the dark. And I'm not going to be here much longer, Sirius. You've seen it. You can see it. You always could see the thing nobody wanted seen. So there's that too. He's going to lose me. He knows it now. He flew out over that sea about it last week, same as you used to. And when it happens, he's going to need someone who's his by blood and by oath and not just by a decade of luck. And that's you. And I need you to be ready to be it. And I need you to forgive me enough to want to. And I know that's a great deal to ask of a man I let believe I was dead for 16 years. And I'm asking it anyway, because it's not for me. It's for him. Sirius was quiet a long time on the shingle. The sea came in and went out. Somewhere up the hill, Effie's goats, that Regulus kept now, made their small night sounds. You always were the one who thought 10 moves ahead, Sirius said at last. And his ruined voice had something in it that was not quite forgiveness and was on the road to it. Even now, even dying, planning who catches him when you drop him. He was quiet again. I hated you for years, you know. In there. He gave me something to do, hating you, hating all of them, the whole rotten family. And now I get out and find you've gone and become the one decent thing the family ever did, worse than Uncle Alfred, and you're dying about it. And I can't even... He stopped. Yeah, he said. Yeah, he said. Yeah, I'll be ready. I'll be it. Merlin helped the both of us, I'll be it, but you listen to me, Reg. And here Sirius turned and gripped his brother's arm hard, the first time the two of them had touched in 16 years. You don't get to just plan your way out of this and hand him off tidy. That thing in your wall, the locket. Dumbledore's been hunting things like it, and so it turns out, have I. Because it's the only thing worth doing with a life I got back by accident. We destroy it. You hear me? Not to save the world. To save you, you self-sacrificing bastard, because that boy up there has already worked out. He's going to lose you. And if there's a chance, any chance, that ending the thing in the wall stops it draining you, then we take it, all of us together, and you don't get to be noble about it. You've been noble about it for 15 years and it's nearly killed you. Let your idiot brother help for once. It's the only thing I've got to give and you're going to let me give it. Sirius took Harry flying the next morning and Regulus watched it from the window. And it was the first time in the lad's life that someone had gone up into the sky with him instead of standing on the ground being afraid for him. And Regulus saw at once what he'd been unable to give. They went its bravery. They wanted to lever and wanted Rishmitzers these under could, not carefully, not with a guardian's held breath, but wildly, gladly, two of a kind who had found each other across a ruined family and 16 years of stone. Sirius laughing his ruined laugh and Harry laughing back, the two of them chasing each other across a ruined family and 16 years of stone. Sirius laughing his ruined, Streels plied healthcare, Cleodpiclid's cultured back. When they came down wind-burned and breathless, Sirius clapped a hand on the back of Harry's neck, rough and easy, the touch of a man who had waited 16 years to touch this exact boy, and said something that made Harry laugh again, and Harry looked up at his godfather with a light in his face that was new, a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing found at last, the way he'd looked the first time he flew at 7, and Regulus understood that whatever the winter took from him, it had given the child this, is time, beflath with the dine, winth nain hartschool and life. He flies like you, Sirius said to Regulus later, not knowing the whole of what he was saying. No, that's wrong. He flies like me. Like I used to. Merlin, Reg, he flies like I did before everything. Where did he get it? He's James's boy. James flew like a brick with ambitions. Where did his son get that? I don't know, Regulus said, which was true. He came to me already himself. I only kept the weather off him long enough for it to show. And that was the truest thing Regulus knew about the whole enterprise of raising them, and he'd said it once before to Dumbledore on a hill, and it was still true, and he was glad to say it to his brother, who of all people would understand it. The cottage held 5 now, and it had never in its life held 5, and the strangeness of it was the best strangeness Regulus had known. Meals became a thing that happened loudly and took hours. Sirius, who had eaten alone or not at all for 16 years, ate like a man remembering how, and told stories. Merlin, the stories, the school stories, James and Lily and the whole lost world of them, and Harry sat and drank in every word about the parents he'd never had, and Hermione fact-checked the stories mercilessly, and caught Sirius embellishing at least twice a night, and Sirius adored her for it, called her the prosecution, waited for her objections and played to them. Creature who had loathed Sirius as a boy with the whole force of his crooked heart, discovered over that fortnight that he could not go on loathing a man the children laughed with, and gave it up grudgingly, and expressed the surrender the only way he knew, by cooking for Sirius the exact foods Sirius had loved as a boy in the old dark house, without a word, setting them down in front of him and stumping off before anyone could remark on it. And Sirius went quiet the first time it happened, and did not say anything either. Because some kindnesses are too large to be caught in the act, and even one mind so far ain't. What noti mine Morrisons, when the up to the Pornidis disapprove and Regulus at the head of it all saying almost nothing, only watching, keeping a perimeter as ever, except that it was full nad, and Science hold nothing, only watching, keeping the perimeter as ever at Sefer, except that it was full now, down. Wainth child. In the star raids, Glees lifted shelmed, and Squald is left at Cardgud with Vise, lied gens down the Kaikan the Sirich. The Spall it's the Dirk Gede. They did not destroy it that winter. That is the truth. And the story does not pretend otherwise, because some things are not the work of a single crisis, but of years, and the locket was one of them. But that winter was the winter they decided to. The winter the family stopped being one man's secret siege and became a thing with allies. A dying brother, a fierce daughter, a reckless son, a hunted godfather, an elf in the walls, and an old wizard in a castle who had been hunting the same darkness from the other end. That winter the War Council convened, and it did not win, but it stopped losing, alone. And the crisis, the real crisis, the one the whole winter had been building toward, came at the very end of the holidays, and it came from the lad's scar. It came the night before the children were to go back to school, and it came because the thing in the wall had spent the whole winter reaching for the newest minds in the house. Hermione's and Harry's mind had a door in it the locket could feel, a splinter of the same soul, calling to it. And on the last night the two pieces of that ruined soul reached for each other across the house, the one in the wall and the one in Harry, and Harry woke screaming with his scar on fire and the dark bloom spreading under the skin of his forehead, the dark cost to 16 months, and the whole house Caton would have howed it wet to dowled. It sped steps. He had done it once. 14 years before, on a cold floor, with a fever and a splinter and a book of black cures, he had given years of his life to put the thing in the child's head back to sleep. He had those years to give then. He did not have them now. He was thin to almost nothing at the center already. The locket had spent 15 years drinking him, and to do again what he'd done at the fever, to pour himself through the old runes and tip the scale with his own life. He did not have enough life left to tip it. It would not be years this time. It would be the rest. He knew this in the space between waking and standing. And he stood anyway and went for the black case because there was no arithmetic in which he did not, no world in which Regulus Black stood in the doorway and watched the darkness take his son to save the scraps of his own dying self. He had gone into a cave meaning to die for a cause. He would go into a boy's fever meaning to die for a person. And the second was worth infinitely more than the first, and he did not hesitate. But he was not alone this time. That was the whole difference. The difference 15 years and a shared secret had made. He knelt over his convulsing son with the black case open and the runes half drawn and Sirius's hands on his shoulders, trying to pull him back, shouting that there had to be another way. And Hermione, 15, top of her year, who did not lose. Hermione was already across the room, already at the sealed door, and she was doing the thing Regulus had never let anyone do. She was taking the problem with her Hermione, and she was shades. You don't have to give your life. You have to give a life equal to the darkness. That's what you said. Tip the scale. Weigh against it. Reg, it doesn't have to be years. It has to be enough. And there are 4 of us. Sirius, get down here, creature. We share it. We all give a little and none of us gives too much. You've been doing the arithmetic wrong for 15 years because you were always alone. One person carrying a weight 4 people could splitness. And Regulus, kneeling over his son with the darkness spreading and his own death in his hands ready to spend, stopped and looked at his daughter and understood that she was right. That the old black cure had been written for a family, for many hands, for a house full of blood to share the cost, and that he had done it alone at the fever only because he'd had no one, and had nearly died of it, and had assumed forever after that the price was 1 life because he had no one, and had nearly died of it, and had assumed forever after that the price was 1 life because he had only ever had 1 life to pay it with. But there were 4 of them now. 4 and an elf. And a weight 1 man could not lift without dying, 5 could lift and only stagger under. Here, Regulus said, and his voice was shaking, and he did not care, and he seized his daughter's clever hand and put it on the first rune. Here, and you speak the second line with me, and Sirius the third, and Creature. Creature knows the old words, he's known them longer than any of us. And you each give a little, you hear me, a little, and the instant I say stop, you stop, and we weigh it together, all of us, against the dark, and they did. The 5 of them knelt on the cold floor over the burning boy in the last hour of the night, and they drew the runes together, and they spoke the old words together, Regulus and Sirius and Hermione and Creature and even Harry himself at the end, conscious enough to give his own small portion, and they each poured out a little, only a little, a weight no one of them would die of. And together it was enough. Together it was more than enough. And the dark bloom under his son's skin drew back and thinned, paled, and slept, the way it had slept 14 years. But alive, kneeling on the floor with his son breathing easy against him and his daughter's hand still gripping his and his brother's arm around them both and the elf weeping openly at last, and Regulus understood at 34, on a cold floor in the last hour of a winter's night, the thing he had spent his whole solitary life not knowing, that the reason he had been dying was not the locket, or not only the locket, it was that he had been carrying all of it, alone, and that he did not have to anymore. And that this weight shared out among the hands that loved him, was the thing his mother's cold and terrible house had never once, in all his gilded, miserable boyhood, taught him a family could be for. Chapter 4. End. Chapter 5. The threshold. They came of age in the summer between the 6th year and the 7th. First Hermione in the September that opened it, and then Harry in the July that closed it, and the coming of age changed the house in a way none of them had quite braced for. Because the 2 children Regulus had hidden on a beach were, by any law the wizarding world recognized, no longer children at all. It sat strangely on him. He was 36 that summer and looked, in the gray coast mirror, a good deal older. The cave's slow work still written under his eyes, though he had stopped dying. That was the plain fact of it. The fact he had not dared believe for the first year after the winter of the shared cost, and had come, slowly, to trust. He had stopped dying the night 5 pairs of hands had taken the weight of Harry's fever off him and split it among them. He had understood, that night, that the drain had never been only the locket. It had been the carrying, the solitude of it. 15 years of standing a perimeter alone, with no one to spell him at the watch. And once the watch was shared, the thing that had been thinning him toward nothing had slowed and stopped, and he had begun, for the first time since the cave, to very slowly come back. Not all the way. He would never have all the way, but enough to see them grown, which was the only distance he'd ever actually asked for. He gave Harry the broom on the lad's 17th birthday, and he did it properly, in the sharp register, the one for the old and dangerous things. Because a black heirloom passed hand to hand was one of the few rituals of his cold family that Regulus had ever thought worth keeping. They went down to the shingle at dawn, the 2 of them, the last day of July, and Regulus carried Alfred's silver-gray broom that had thrown him twice at Harry's age, and known Harry the instant Harry first touched it at 7. And he put it into his son's hands and said the thing his Uncle Alfred had said to him, the only inheritance from that whole ruined lineage he'd ever wanted the hand on. This has carried blacks for 200 years, Regulus said. It knew you before I did. It took you up the first day you touched it, at 7, and it threw me twice. And it never once loved anyone in the family the way it loves you, and it's yours now. Outright, no strings, the way my uncle gave it to me. He was the one decent man the family made before me, and they burned his name off the wall for the crime of being kind. And he left me this and a way of thinking about what a family could be. And I've spent your whole life trying to be worth the second thing, so here. He let go of the broom. You're of age. You're a man, by every law there is. You don't need my leave to fly anymore or to do anything, and you won't have needed it for years, and I'll have gone on giving it out of habit, and you'll have to forgive me for that, because a father doesn't stop at the exact legal minute. He tapers. But the broom's yours, and the name's yours, if you want it, which no one's ever offered you. And I'm offering now, you can be Harry Potter, which is your father's name, and a good one, and you should be proud of it. Or you can be a Black, which is a name most of the world is right to fear, and which I have spent 17 years trying to make mean one single decent thing. You don't have to choose today. You don't have to choose ever. But I wanted you to know the door was open both ways, because your whole life people decided who you were before you got a say, and I'll not be one more of them. It's yours to pick. Like the word when you were 7. You picked Reg then. You pick this in your own time. Harry held the broom in the dawnlight and did not fly it. Not yet. Held it and looked at the man who'd raised him. And when he answered in the plain register, the true one. I'll keep Potter, he said. Because you're right, it's my dad's and he died for me and I want to carry it. But, and here his voice did the thing it did. Went rough. Led with the heart. I want it to be Potter the way you made it mean something. Not the famous one. Not the one in the books about the war. I want to be my dad's son the way you taught me to be. Which is, small, and muddy, and kind, and not a story. And when I've got kids, he stopped, coloring, 17, the future rushing at him. When I've got kids, I'm going to tell them about a Black. The decent one. The one after your uncle. I'm gonna tell them the family had 2 decent men in 200 years and I was raised by the second one. And that's the part of the name that matters. And that's yours, Reg. That's the inheritance. And I don't need the broom to get it. I've had it my whole life. And then, because he was Harry, because he could never leave a moment too heavy, also I'm absolutely keeping the broom. That part's not up for speech. It's mine. It's always been mine. It never liked you. Everyone knows. And Regulus had laughed, once, on the dawn shingle, the nearest thing to a laugh he had, and Harry had got on the broom, his uncle's broom that was now his own broom, and gone up into the July morning over the sea. 17 and of age, and free. And Regulus had stood on the beach and watched his son fly. The way he had watched him fly at 7, except that now there was no fear in the watching, only the clean strange I'd have made. He watched them be adults and found it the strangest of all the strangenesses. Hermione had her apparition license and a stack of career pamphlets and a fury, still, always the fury, aimed now at the whole architecture of a world that she had decided, at 17, to spend her life renovating. She had grown into her formidableness so completely that strangers were frightened of her before she'd finished a sentence, and Regulus, who had helped make her, felt about it the way a man feels watching a thing he planted come up taller than the house. Harry had filled out and steadied. The recklessness had found its channel. The leaping heart had learned where the hearth was, exactly as Regulus had promised Paget on the shingle a decade before. The magic will follow the love. It always does. And it had. And the frightening, ungoverned power of the 7-year-old on the beach had become, at 17, a deep, banked, steady strength that the child carried lightly and spent carefully and never once used to be cruel. And they were, that summer, in love. And everyone in the house knew it, and none of them had said it, least of all the 2 people it was happening to. It had been coming since they were 15, since the cold-lit night Regulus had watched Harry close a hand's width of dark air to hold his grieving sister, and it had come the way the tide comes, without any single moment you could point to and say, there, that was when. But it crossed some line that summer, out loud in the open, and Regulus knew the day it crossed because he saw the after of it, though never think Merlin, the during, because a man is owed some mercies, and not seeing his children fall in love is one of them. He came back from the byre one long light evening. He kept Effie's goats now, had kept them for 3 years, walked up most evenings to let them in, a small inherited duty he'd grown to need, and the 2 of them were down on the shingle by the harbor they still built each summer, and they were standing close, closer than the careful hand's width they'd kept between them for 2 years, and Hermione's head was against Harry's shoulder, and Harry had his arm around her, and they were not talking, only looking at the sea, and there was a stillness around the 2 of them. That Regulus to time could house figure get me twice to that and he went back to the house. He did not let them know he'd seen. And when they came in later, apart, careful, both of them wearing the particular transparent nonchalance of the newly and secretly happy, Regulus said nothing and passed Hermione the bread and asked Harry about the goats as though he had not just seen the entire shape of both their futures rearrange itself on a beach, and the 2 of them exchanged one swift glance across the table, the glance of people who think they've gotten away with something. And Regulus let them think, because letting them think it was the kindest thing. The moment it happened for them had happened a week before that, and it belonged entirely to the two of them, and Regulus never knew the shape of it. And it is only set down here because a story about a bond that grew across 17 years owes the reader the hour the bond found its last name. It was late, and they were on the shingle, and they'd been arguing. About nothing, about a book, about whether Hermione worked too hard, the oldest argument they had, worn smooth as a beach stone from 17 years of use. And in the middle of it, Hermione had stopped and gone still. The way she went still now when Harry came into her room, and she had said, "Not about the book at all. I'm frightened of it. Us. This. Because if it goes wrong, I don't lose a boy I fancied, Harry. I lose you're my whole life. You've been my life since I was 2, and I can survive losing almost anything. I've done the sums. I can survive losing almost anything except you, and this is the one way I could actually lose you, if we try this and it breaks. So I've been not trying it for 2 years, because not trying felt safer, and I'm so tired of being frightened of the one good thing." And she'd run out, which Hermione almost never did, and stood there on the shingle having accepted a dear with the and Harry, who led with his heart, who closed the hands with the veil, who had known where Hermione was in every room since he was 11. Harry had said, "It can't break. That's the thing you've got wrong, and you're never wrong, so listen. It can't break because it isn't a new thing that could fall over. It's the oldest thing either of us has. We're not building something that might collapse, Hermione. We're just, finally, saying the name of something that's been holding the whole rest of our lives up the entire time. You can't lose me by loving me out loud. You could only ever lose me by pretending we were something smaller than we are. And we tried that for 2 years, and it was awful, and I'm done." And then he'd taken her hand on the shingle. In the dark, the way he'd taken it at the fever when he was too small to remember, and Hermione had stopped being frightened, all at once, the way a fever breaks, and had leaned in. And the first time was quiet and entirely unremarkable to anyone but the two of them, for whom it rearranged the world, a boy and a girl who had shared a pillow at 3 finally, at fine wine weight, and afterward they had not made a great business of it. They had walked back up the shingle a careful distance apart, both of them lit up like lamps and pretending furiously that they weren't, and that was the after Regulus caught the edge of, a week later, from the top of the beach, and knew better than to see the whole of, it weeful. It was Sirius who forced it into the open, into the over center then. It was Sirius who dang. But the short of it is that Peter Pettigrew had been found, alive, a rat no longer, dragged into the light at last by a combination of Dumbledore's patience and Sirius's rage and one piece of luck the size of a nation. And Sirius Black had walked out of the world, had done him a free man, publicly, with an apology from a pedestal proudly moving half to cultated Nordland's Gatehest. He was there most weekends. He was there that summer. And he took one look at Harry and Hermione being transparently nonchalant across a dinner table, and put his fork down and said to the whole table, with the delighted cruelty of a man who has waited weeks for the moment, "So when's one of you going to tell the poor man his children are courting, or are we all going to keep pretending we can't see it? Reg, you're too." "They're serious," Regulus said. They're absolutely, look at them. They've gone the same color. Serious. It's the worst kept secret since your own funeral, and I mean that with love." And Harry had put his face in his hands, and Hermione had gone the exact red of the vinewood in her wand, and Creature had dropped a serving spoon, and the whole table had dissolved into the particular chaos that only a family produces, and Regulus, at the head of it, over the ruin of the dinner and the wreck of his children's composure, had done the thing that settled it, which was to say, dryly, into the noise, "I've known since they were 15. I was waiting for the 2 cleverest people in Britain to work out something the goats had noticed. Pass the salt." And the table had roared, and Harry had looked up from his hands with his face aflame and something in his eyes that was half mortification and half a desperate need to know, his son's whole heart in it as ever, and he'd said, You're all right with it?" "You're not, Harry." Regulus had set down the salt. He'd looked at the two of them, the lad he'd taken from a cupboard and the girl he'd found in a shed, grown now, adults now, red-faced and terrified across his dinner table because the thing they'd become to each other mattered so much, they were frightened of what he'd say. "You've been each other's home since before you could talk. I said that to you on a railway platform when you were 11. And I meant it as a comfort, and it turns out I was describing the future. There's no one alive I would rather see either of you love than the other. I built the whole of this." He gestured at the house, the table, the crooked dog on the mantel, all of it, around a thing the two of you already were. This is only the two of you finding the last name for it. Of course I'm all right with it. I'm the opposite of not all right with it. Now for Merlin's sake, eat, both of you, before Creature takes it as a criticism and we never hear the end. And that had been that. Said and done and blessed, in the middle of a wrecked dinner, in the only register that house had ever needed for the true things, which was the plain one, the one with nothing guarded in it. And later that night Hermione had come and found Regulus alone by the fire, and stood a moment, and then said, quiet, "Thank you. For the way you did that. You made it not frightening. It was so frightening, and you just made it not. And Regulus had said, it was never a thing to be frightened of. It was the least surprising development in the history of this family. The goats called it years ago, and she'd laughed, wet, and hugged him hard, the girl from the shed, and gone up to bed, and Regulus had sat by the fire a while turning over the astonishing fact that the two lost children he'd hidden on a beach had found, in each other, the one thing his own cold family had never once managed to grow, which was a love that asked nothing and forgave everything and would, he had no doubt at all, outlast every one of them. They talked about the future that autumn, the last one, in the way you talk about a thing you can finally afford to want. For 17 years, the future had been a dangerous country. Regulus had never let himself plan past the next term, the next winter, because a man being drained by the thing in his wall does not buy furniture for a house he may not live in. But he had stopped dying, and the children had grown, and the locket was a problem with a shape now instead of a life sentence. And so for the first time, the family let itself sit at the kitchen table and imagine what came after. Hermione wanted the ministry, which surprised no one, and wanted to break it and remake it, which surprised no one either. She had a list. She had, Regulus suspected, several lists, ranked. She would start somewhere small and unglamorous, she said. Some department nobody fought over, magical creatures most likely, because that was where the injustice she'd noticed first at 11 still ran deepest, and she would be there a decade being right at people until the whole rotten edifice of blood law and creature law, and the thousand small cruelties the wizarding world had decided not to see, began. Under the steady, unbearable pressure of one woman who did not lose to give, Regulus listened to her lay it out at the table and thought, they have no idea what's coming for them. The ministry has survived dragons and dark lords, and it is going to be brought down, plank by plank, by a muggle-born girl I found in a shed, and it will not know what hit it, and I will not live to see the whole of it, but I have seen enough of her to know it's coming. Harry did not have a list. Harry had never had a list. That was Hermione's country. Harry wanted, he said haltingly, coloring, to teach flying. Not a grand thing. Not the Aurors which everyone had assumed, the boy who lived turned dark wizard catcher, the story the world would have written for him. Harry wanted to teach children to fly, small ones, first years, the ones frightened of the broom the way he'd been frightened of thunder, and he wanted to be the one who stood up in the sky, with them, instead of on the ground. Be skated by his height of what's he said it like a confession, like it was too small a want for a boy the world had built into a legend, and Regulus said, that's the least small thing I've ever heard you say. And meant it, because a man who has been made into a story and chooses instead to teach frightened children a small brave thing has understood something most people never do, which was the whole of what Regulus had tried to teach them. Leave them room to be ordinary. It is the only real gift. Sirius, for his part, had a future for the first time in 20 years and did not know what to do with it, and said so, and the family absorbed him into theirs without quite deciding to. He'd been cleared. That had taken 2 years and Dumbledore's whole weight and a rack dragged into the light, and it deserved more telling than this story has room for. But the heart of it was simple. The truth had come out. The way truth had come out, the way truth sometimes does, late and insufficient and better than nothing. And Sirius Black had gotten back a name and a fortune and a freedom he no longer knew how to spend. He tried grand things. At first, the way a starred man overeats. He bought a flying motorbike. He gave away half his gold to war orphans in a single mad afternoon. And then he'd stopped and come north and discovered that the thing he actually wanted, after 12 years of stone and 2 years of freedom he couldn't taste, was a cold cottage and a loud dinner table, and a godson who flew like he used to, and a brother he'd wasted 16 years being wrong about. And he took the one thing the family had to give, which was a paledlia to Boboldi. There was a night that autumn, the last of the childhood ones, though none of them named it so, when the whole crooked five were round the fire. Harry and Hermione tangled together now in the open, no longer pretending, Hermione's feet in Harry's lap and a book in her hands. Sirius telling a story Creature was correcting from the hearth, Regulus at the edge of it keeping the watch he'd never quite learned to put down. And Harry, out of nowhere, in a lull, said, Reg, tell about the harbor, the first one, when we were little and we moved all the stones and the tide kept taking it. And Regulus told it, though they'd all lived it, because that was what the story was for, not information but the pleasure of a thing well worn. How they'd surveyed and hauled and built, and how the tide took it every night, and how Hermione at 8 had declared the harbor wasn't for lasting, it was for building again, bigger, and how they had every summer bigger, for 14 years, and Hermione, grown her feet in the lap of Harry she'd shared a pillow with, said the thing she'd said at 8, the philosophy that had turned out to be about everything. It's not for lasting, it's for building again. And nobody said anything for a moment, because they'd all worked out by then, older, that she had never once been talking only about the harbor, that she'd been describing the whole of what they were, a thing the sea kept taking and they kept rebuilding, bigger, out of the same stones on the same beach, world without end. They destroyed the locket at the turn of that year, in the deep of the winter, and they did it together, all of them. And it was the culmination of 6 years' work, and it took less than an hour, and it nearly went wrong twice, and it is the last hard thing the story has to tell. They had spent those 6 years learning how. That was the true labor, the long, unglamorous study, and most of it was Hermione's, because Hermione did not lose and had decided in a kitchen at 15 that she would find the way to end the thing, that he would find the way to end the thing that had been eating the only father she'd known, and she had spent 6 years finding it. She had learned that a Horcrux could not be undone by ordinary magic, that it had to be destroyed by a force so complete the fragment of soul could not repair the vessel. Basilisk venom, or fiend fire, or a handful of other terrible irreversible things, and that any of them, applied to the locket, would first have to get past the thing's defenses, its whispering, its ancient malice, its trick of finding the softest fear in whoever came near it and pressing on it until they broke. They had the venom. That was Dumbledore's contribution in Sirius's daring, a single fang from the basilisk that had died in the chamber beneath Hogwarts years before, retrieved at no small risk, kept in a lead box, because the venom would eat through anything else. And they had, at last, the thing Regulus had never had in 15 years of facing the locket alone. They had each other and the 6-year study of exactly how the thing attacked, and a plan built on the one principle the whole family had learned in the winter of the shared cost, which was that a weight that broke one person could be carried by 5 who loved each other. They did it in the sealed room, the room Hermione had found at 8 and promised not to measure, and finally, at 17, been let all the way into. Regulus opened the stone. The thing behind it was awake, and it was afraid. Regulus felt its fear the moment the stone came away, and it was the first time in 15 years he had ever felt the locket afraid, because it had spent those 15 years being the only awake and hating thing in a house of sleepers. And now it opened its stone to find 5 people who loved each other standing in a ring around it, with a basilisk fang and no fear it could reach. And it knew, the way such things know, that its long solitary reign of whispering was ending. It fought. Of course it fought. It opened the locket, the way they do at the end, and it poured out its whole armory. The smoke and the voices and the visions, and it went for each of them in turn, finding the softest place and pressing. It showed Sirius 12 years of Azkaban and told him he'd never really left, that this was a dream the Dementors were letting him have before they took his soul. It showed Hermione a world that had looked at everything she was and everything she'd built and decided she was Muggle-born, and therefore nothing, let in on sufferance, a fraud who'd never belonged. And it showed her Regulus dead of the thing she'd failed to destroy in time. It showed Creature the old dark house and the mother Creature had served, and told him he'd betrayed her by loving these unworthy children. It showed Harry his parents, and the cupboard, and every abandonment that hadn't happened but might have, and it showed him Regulus dying and Hermione dead, and himself alone. The one thing Harry had feared since he was 7 years old on a cliff road, demanding the universe spare the people he loved, and it showed Regulus the cave. It always showed him the cave. 15 years, and it had never found anything that landed harder than the black water and the dead hands and his own drowned face, the death he had gone looking for and failed to keep, and it showed it to him now, one last time. And it told him what it had always told him, that he should have stayed dead, that every day since was stolen, that the 2 children in the room with him were only borrowing a man who belonged in the water. But here was the thing the locket did not understand, had never understood, could not understand, because it was made from a soul that had cut itself to pieces precisely to avoid ever learning it. It was attacking 5 people who could see each other being attacked. That was the whole of the plan and the whole of the answer. Alone, any one of them would have broke him. The thing was too old and too cruel, and it found the soft places too well. But they were not alone. When it showed Hermione a world that called her nothing, Harry, bleeding from his own vision, fighting his own, reached out and took her hand and said, "You're a spring," Reg said. "It rose up out of you." "It's a lie, Hermione. It's the oldest lie there is. Don't you dare believe a dead man's soul over the people who love you." And she heard him through the smoke, and held on, and did not break. When it told Sirius he'd never left Azkaban, Regulus, drowning in his own cave, his own black water, said across the room, hoarse, "You're in my house, you idiot. In the north with the goats. I can smell the goats. Does Azkaban smell of goats? Does Azkaban smell of goats? Hold on." And Sirius laughed, a broken laugh at the goats. And the laugh was a rope and he climbed it. When it showed Regulus the cave, when it showed him his own drowned face and told him he was stolen time, Hermione, who did not lose, looked straight at him through the whole storm of it and said the thing that ended it. The thing 6 years and a whole life had been building to. "You didn't stay dead because we needed you. That's not stolen. That's the opposite of stolen. You came out of that water, and you found him in a cupboard, and you found me in a shed, and you gave 2 children who had nothing a home. And if that's borrow time, then borrow it forever, Reg, because we're not giving back. Now put the fang in it. It's just a thing in a wall. It's just a broken thing." And her voice cracked on the last of it, on the oldest word, on the family password. The thing she'd commanded at 3 and built a life on. "It's broken. Fix it. All of us. Now." And Rhett and Smyman chained Terry said he ate. And then only that the tore him loose, and he'd won 4 when an elf tore him loose, except that this time it was not an Elf Engelwin, on an elf, all him wind and rope at once, and he took the basilisk fangen in hair, and Harry he's small ancient hair, Harkin hoba and Harkits Mike and Elabem Holva. Schwad the women have fine about how about the hebes of good dev came it. It screamed in the private language it had whispered in for 15 years, screamed with the voice of the man who had made it, and the black water poured out of it and the dead hands reached one last time and found nothing to hold, because there was nothing soft left in that room for it to grip. Only 5 people fused into one grip around one fang, and the venom did what venom does, complete and irreversible, and the fragment of ruined soul that had hated in Regulus's wall for 15 years came apart and thinned and paled and was, after everything, simply gone. The silence afterward was the loudest thing Regulus had ever heard. He had lived 15 years with a thing in his house that hated him. A wake in the walls, a cold pressure at the edge of every quiet moment, and he had grown so used to it that he had stopped knowing it was there. The way you stop hearing the sea, and now it was gone, and the absence of it was enormous. A silence with a shape, the shape of a weight lifted after so long that the body has forgotten it was carrying anything and staggers when it's gone. Regulus stood in the sealed room with the spent fang in his hand and the ruined locket smoking at his feet and his family's hands still over his, and he felt the cold pressure that had been at the edge of him for 15 years simply lift, and he made a sound, one, small, that he had not planned to make, and Hermione's arms were around him and Harry's, and then all of them, the whole crooked 5, standing in the room that had held the worst thing in the world, holding each other in the loud new silence where it used to be. "It's gone," Harry said, into it, wondering, checking, as he checked the crooked dog on the mantel. "Reg, it's actually gone. It worked. It's your..." And he could not finish it, the size of it, the fact that the thing that had been draining the man for 15 years was ended and the man was still standing, and Regulus finished it for him, in the plain register, the true one. "It's gone. It's over. I'm here." And then, because he was still himself, still Regulus, still incapable of leaving a moment undried, and someone is going to have to clean venom off my floor, and it's not going to be me, I've had a difficult evening. And they laughed, all of them, in the loud silence, the way you laugh when a thing you have been afraid of for your whole life is suddenly, impossibly, behind you. And Creature went to fetch a mop with tears running openly down his ancient face and dignity entirely abandoned, and it was over. The long siege was over, and the house on the cold coast held nothing in its walls anymore but the family that lived in it. The spring after the lock had died was the first ordinary spring of Regulus Black's life, and he did not know what to do with it, and learned. He had spent every previous spring of his adult life braced, for the Death Eaters who'd hated him, for the thing in the wall, for the slow poison thinning him toward nothing. And now there was nothing to brace for. The locket was gone. Sirius was cleared. The children were grown and safe and had chosen. Both of them, the small good, ordinary lives he'd spent 17 years trying to leave them room for. And Regulus woke one morning that spring and lay still a while listening, out of 15 years of habit, for the cold awake hating thing in the walls, and there was only the sea, and the goats up the hill, and Creature clattering breakfast, and Sirius's motorbike that he'd sworn he'd sold and hadn't, and the 2 young voices arguing amiably about nothing in the next room. And Regulus lay in the quiet ordinary morning and understood that the siege was actually over, that he could stop keeping the watch, that a man was allowed, after everything, to simply live in the house he'd saved. It did not come easily. A body that has stood guard for 15 years does not learn to sit down all at once. He caught himself, that spring, doing the old rounds out of habit, checking wards that no longer needed checking, patrolling a perimeter that no longer had an enemy on the other side of it. And Hermione caught him at it once, at dawn, walking the boundary of the property with his wand out from pure muscle memory, and she did not laugh at him. She came and walked it with him, the whole boundary, in the gray light. And at the end of it she took the wand gently out of his hand and put it away in his pocket and said, "It's done. You can stop now. That's the whole reward, Reg. You don't have to guard it anymore. You just get to have it." And she tucked her arm through his and walked him back to the house where breakfast was, and he'd let her, and it was the first morning he could remember in his whole life that he had not, somewhere at the back of himself, been afraid. He kept the crooked dog. He'd had a thought that spring of mending it properly at last, of using magic to make the 4th leg match the others, and he'd taken it down off the mantel and looked at it, one-legged, splinted in matchwood and glue by a family 14 years before, and he'd put it back exactly as it was, crooked, because some things you do not fix, you only keep, and the crookedness was the whole of the point, was the record of the winter they mended it together. And to make it match would be to soothe the thing that met it wouldn't whoever it have a fix it, the family joke, had never meant make it perfect. It had meant mend it together and love it crooked. And the dog stood crooked on the mantel that spring and every spring after, and that was right. There was the matter of Creature that spring, and it deserves its telling, because the elf had raised those 2 children as much as anyone in the house and had never once been thanked for it in any coin the world recognized. Hermione had spent years by then on the question of house elves. It was the injustice she'd noticed first and let go of last, and she had learned, painfully, over her school years, that the question was harder than her 11-year-old fury had thought. that an elf freed against its will could be broken by the freeing, that the kindness was not as simple as a sock. She had made mistakes about it. She had learned from them because she was Hermione, and that was the whole of what she did. And that spring, grown, of age, she came to Kreacher not with a plan to free him, but with a question, which was the thing she'd finally understood you had to lead with. What do you want? Not what I think you should want. What do you actually want, Kreacher? Because whatever it is, we'll make it happen. You've given this family your whole life and nobody ever asked you what you wanted for yours. And Kreacher, who had served the cruel and the mad and the cold in the old dark house, who had wept at the thought of mudbloods, and then spent 14 years building driftwood towers for a muggle-born girl to knock down, who had been asked, in 100 years of service, what he wanted exactly. Never-timer Kreacher had looked at Hermione for a long time with his enormous ancient eyes, and then he had done a thing that undid the whole room. He had reached up, the way he'd reached up the first snowbound night to tuck the blue blanket over her bare foot. And he had straightened the collar of the girl he'd helped raise, fussing, buying himself a moment, and he had said in his cracked old voice, Kreacher wants to stay. Kreacher does not want a sock. Kreacher wants, and here the old voice had failed and steadied and gone on. Kreacher wants to see the young ones' children. That is what Kreacher wants, to stay until there are little ones again, and to feed them, and to catch their towers when they fall. That is the whole of what Kreacher wants, and no one has ever asked, and Kreacher thanks the young mistress for asking, and Kreacher will be very cross if he cries about it, because Kreacher is not free. Kreacher is family, and there is a difference, and the young mistress of all people should know it, being family herself, who came with a rabbit and no other thing. And Hermione had cried about it, and Kreacher had been very cross, and it had been, in its way, the truest freeing in the house, because the elf had been given the one thing his whole long servitude had never offered, which was a choice, and had chosen, freely, the family that had never once treated him as anything less. Regulus, who had inherited Kreacher along with all the family's other ruins, and had watched the elf transform across 17 years from a creature of the old cruelty into something none of them had a proper word for, understood that the house had made Kreacher over the way it had made him over, that they were, the two of them, the elf and the dead man, the family's two great renovations. Both of them, the elf and the dead man, the family's two great renovations, both of them things old cold lineage had built for one purpose, and the children had quietly rebuilt for another. The last of it is a wedding, and it is not the one you are thinking of. Or it is not only that one, and it happened years past the winter. The locket died, and this story reaches forward to touch it because the man in it once made a promise on a cliff road, and a coast has to be shown holding. Harry married Hermione in the spring, on the shingle below the cottage by the harbor they had built, and rebuilt every summer of their lives, and they built it one last time that year, bigger than ever, and this time, because there was magic enough among the guests to do it, and because Hermione had finally decided a thing was allowed to last. This time, they set the stones so the sea could not take them back, and the harbor stayed, and stays, a low curved arm of stone reaching into a pool that holds its water at every tide, the first thing those two ever made to me, the last thing. Half the village came, the new village. The young ones who'd grown up while the old ones went into the churchyard. Sirius stood up for Harry and cried the whole way through and denied it furiously afterward. Kreacher, who had raised these two as much as anyone, wore a tea towel pressed and starched like a robe of state and considered himself the true master of ceremonies, and was more or less correct. Dumbledore was gone by then. That is a grief that belongs to another story. But he had lived to hear it was coming, and had written, and the letter was read out, and it made everyone cry again, including Sirius, who denied that too. And Regulus stood at the edge of it, at the perimeter, as he always had, in a good coat, keeping the watch he no longer had to keep because there was nothing left to watch for, and Harry found him there before it started, as Harry had always found him, and stood beside him a moment, looking at the sea. "You made it," Harry said. Quiet, not looking at him. "Before I got married, you said, on the cliff, when Tam died, you said, before I got married, I was 7. I made it a rule." His voice had gone rough. "You kept it. You're here. You kept a promise you had no way of keeping, and you kept it, Reg. You're standing right here. I told you I'd hold to it," Regulus said. "You had no way to hold to it. You were dying. For years you were, and you held to it anyway. You decided, and then you didn't die. You just decided not to. And it worked, that's not. People can't do that, no," Regulus agreed. "People can't. I didn't do it by deciding. I did it by not being alone, which is the only magic I ever learned that was worth anything. And it took me 34 years and 2 children and a shed in the snow to learn it, and I learned it too late to save the child I was, and just in time to become the man you know. That's the whole of it. That's the only wisdom I've got to hand you on your wedding day, and it's this. You cannot carry the ones you love alone. It will kill you, slowly, and you'll call it love, and it's only pride wearing love's coat. Let them carry you back. That's what she's for." He nodded down the shingle to where Hermione was, in white, being fussed over by Sirius and a starched elf. "That's what you're for each other. I spent 15 years standing a perimeter alone because I thought that was what a father was. It nearly killed me, and it taught you the wrong thing by example, and I've spent the years since trying to untitch it. So learn the right thing from me instead. The day it gets too heavy, you put it down between the two of you and you carry it together, and you never once, not ever, try to be the whole wall by yourself. Promise me that. It's the last oid and brood. Waiter he treatoined, and wide him out a caldert, and raised him on a cold code, and stood a perimeter alone for 15 years, so that a hunted child could grow up muddy and ordinary and loved, and Harry said, it brew tive, and rude, and while starm. In rolla carol scarmic a child, he'd scald him a zamk. Down the shingle the sea came in and did not take the harbor. The stones held. Hermione was laughing at something Sirius had said, her whole formidable face undone with it, and she looked up the beach and found Harry and Regulus at the perimeter, and her face changed, went soft and certain, and she started up the shingle toward them, toward the two men she loved most in the world, in white in the spring light, on the coast that held, and Regulus let go of his son, and straightened his coat and went down to give away the girl he'd found in a shed in the snow, on the beach where he'd raised her, in front of everyone, at last in the open, as himself. He was there, as an over later brerit. One was Mithen Raiders. He hasn't one theed ever wants. Grandchildren, eventually, who called him something the old dark house had never once heard spoken kindly, and who grabbed his hair and pulled it like a bell for service, exactly as their father had at 16 months on a first grey winter, and whom John Scudred retargrained and redrawed ceremonied, and set back down, and stoled in the plain flat registrator, that the cancer go audit, and its kids to get it held egg.